back into their room to take her blades out of Callum's pack, but Callum's in there, and as far as she can tell, this bastard only wants her. She heads down the stairs instead, ignoring the thwip of arrows as they fly past her ears, bracing her belly with her free hand. Only to find the guards stationed in their hole in a heap by her feet at the foot of the stairwell and another sword in her face. The second assassin smirks. "Didn't expect to see you down here, your highness," she drawls. "Same here," snaps Rayla, pushing the sword out of the way with a dagger. "What do you want?" "To get paid, obviously," says the assassin with a smirk. "Thanks for making it so easy." She lunges forward, swiping at Rayla's bump, and Rayla dodges back until her back is against the wall and there's nowhere to go. She rolls out of the way once, but the first assassin's caught up to her now, and he slams her back against the stones, his fingers around her throat. "You're quick, I'll give you that," he hisses. "Let's not waste any more time, shall we?" "Let's not." The second assassin crumples first, and Rayla gasps when the fingers around her neck loosen as a spear bursts through the first's front. She collapses when he does, her throat bruised and her breathing shallow, but a pair of arms haul her upwards before she has the chance to recover. "Eleni." Eleni smiles grimly at her, her armor spattered with blood. "We have to get you out of here." But another window crashes upstairs, and Rayla pales. There's only one other window it could be, and Callum's still up there, vulnerable and defenseless. She shakes her head, picking the dagger off the ground, pushing past Eleni to race back up the stairs without another word. Her heart is slamming away in her throat when she gets there, as 3 more assassins climb in through the window at the end of the hall. Eleni slips in front of her, raising her spear to give her time to get to Callum. "Go," she snaps. "Quickly, princess." Rayla does, her throat dry, shouldering their bedroom door open as Eleni spins her spear in one hand to knock an arrow of the air. There are 2 more in here too, their attention on Callum as he stirs in the bed. Rayla's heart drops through the floor, and she reacts without thinking, "Hey. You're being paid for me, not him." They turn to stare at her, and they exchange glances for a moment before one shrugs and tosses his javelin at her head. Rayla rolls out of the way. Callum's pack is on the floor at the foot of the bed, the hilts of her blades peeking out of the gap in the material. She ducks under the swipe of the sword, dodges another throwing knife as it's thrown at her, slides across the freezing stone floor on her knees and has the time to take one out of his pack as a sword swings at her over her head. She flicks the blade into its hook form, uses it to catch the assassin's sword and knock it out of his hands. She kicks at his knees and sends him tumbling to the ground beside her, giving her enough time to take the other out of Callum's pack, but the other assassin's too quick for her. He knocks her back, her weapons flying out of her hands, pain shooting through her back and her belly as she hits the ground. Then a foot flies into her chest, dangerously close to the bump, and Rayla gasps, curling into herself to protect it, her vision blurring and her blades just out of reach when. "What the hell are you doing to my wife?" Then there's light in the room, bright and shimmering and magical, and a Spyro Frigis. The assassins barely have time to yelp. The cold wind of Callum's frozen breath spell blows over her, and the next thing she knows is one tipping, his arm shattering across the stones as he falls. She should feel relief. She should feel her morale rising. She should feel confident that they might get out of this alive now, but she cries out instead, the pain in her belly too real to ignore, even as Callum helps her up off the floor. Eleni's still fighting outside, and she raises a finger, tries to tell him to help her while she catches her breath. Callum understands, he stumbles to his feet and falls clumsily through the door. Rayla thinks she hears him cast another spell, thinks she hears a cry and sees fire in the hall, but moon above, it hurts and she can't focus and something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong. She staggers to her feet, her throat raw, her chest bruised, her belly aching when she gets to the doorway to find Eleni and Callum huffing amidst the smell of smoke and burned flesh. "Callum," she rasps, clutching the bump. "Callum, something's wrong." She falls to her knees in the doorway, her vision going dark as blood, warm between her legs, soaks into the material of her shift. Chapter 13. Summary. No. This can't be happening. This can't, oh gods. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 13. Callum's heart stops. There's smoke in the air, and bodies on the ground, and voices sounding from the floor below them. Vaguely he hears soldiers, their own, this time, clanking up the stairs and Eleni's voice barking orders at them, but none of it registers. Time slows. He forgets how to breathe. His knees buckle, but he hardly feels the ground as it rushes up to meet them. Rayla. The baby. No. This can't be happening. This can't, oh gods. Your Highness. That's Eleni, he thinks. She sounds as terrified as he feels, her voice hoarse and shaking, but there's a maternal sort of authority in it. Restarts time. Your Highness, we have to get her to Rowena. There might still be time to save the baby, but we have to go now. Callum starts forward, catches Rayla with shaking hands as she sways on her knees, the stain on her shift growing slowly but steadily as his heart hammers in half seconds in his throat. Go, he manages. Take Vorobei. We'll meet you at the Wishbone. Your Highness, what if there are more of them? I'll deal with them if there are, snaps Callum. Go. Hurry. Hesitation flashes in Eleni's eyes, but she doesn't argue. Her armor rattles as she sprints down the hall, and Callum turns back to Rayla at last, his face pale as he readjusts his grip on her shoulders. Rayla, he mutters. Rayla, look at me. We have to get you out of here. Things might still be okay, but we have to go now, okay? Can you stand? She only whimpers, the pain and the panic too much to deal with at once. She shuts her eyes tight against his shoulder, braces herself against it as he tries to lift them both off the ground, but she lets out a cry as they straighten, her body curling in on itself, the fingers of her free hand clutched tightly under the bump. Callum grimaces, reluctant to hurt her more or to make it worse, but there are few other options. He slips an arm under her knees and lifts, holds her to his chest like she's precious cargo, and hurries down the hall. The stables aren't so far from here, and if he moves quickly, they might still be able to. He swallows the thought, afraid to hope. They don't run into any other assassins. Vaguely, Callum feels the beginnings of a thought about that and its implications, but Rayla groans in his arms and it vanishes. There's only room for one thing in his mind right now, and it's her and the baby, and gods, he's scared. Please let them be okay, please let there be time. Callum, she whines. Callum, the baby. I know. He swallows, holding her tighter still as he rushes out of Central Keep and down the Bailey steps. The stables are there, and Kuritz's outside, saddled and ready and waiting with the guards that appeared in the tower. One rushes forward to meet him, his arms open to take Rayla from him, but Callum hesitates. For a split second, he forgets how to trust them, like he's afraid to let anyone else touch her, afraid that they might want her dead too, but the guard's expression softens, understanding in his eyes. He backs away immediately, and then the split second is gone, and Callum nods, and beckons him forward again. There are words caught helpless in his throat, a thanks, maybe. He's not really sure, but he lets the guard take Rayla, mounts Kuritsa, settling against the back half of the saddle, and braces his wife in his arms as the guard passes her back. Kuritsa brays under their weight, unused to carrying the both of them, and Callum mutters an apology to her, his free hand patting her mane. Find my brother, he tells the guards, shaking Kuritsa's reins with one clumsy hand. Tell him what happened. Make sure he's safe. To Rayla, he adds, hold on, okay. Just a little bit longer. She sucks in a shuddering breath, a sob, and says nothing else. Time slows again while they ride. Callum could swear that the trip is faster than this when Kuritsa's walking, but even in the canter he urges her into, it still feels like hours before the hanging sign of the Wishbone even comes into view. Vorobei's already there, and Eleni and Rowena must hear Kuritsa's hooves against the stones or something, because they come rushing out to meet them as the mare slows to a stop. There's a lamp swinging from Rowena's hands that sheds light onto the stain on Rayla's shift for the first time, dark and red and wet against the deep green of her skirt, and Callum feels his throat close at the sight of it. How much blood has she lost? That's it, I think, he manages hoarsely. He thinks he hears Rowena murmur thanks the gods under her breath, and his throat opens again, daring to hope. She and Eleni hold their arms out, easing Rayla from the saddle with careful hands, and Rayla whimpers as they tug her out of his grasp. Her knees buckle when her feet touch the ground, but Rowena catches her, her shoulder braced under Rayla's armpit as she helps her into the shop. Alis is there too, a second lantern in hand. Sit her down, he says, stepping forward. Just there, by the counter. Callum, yeah, behind her, let her lean on you. Your Highness, says Rowena. There's kindness in her voice, even in its urgency. Your Highness, listen to me, we need to see what Bub's doing, okay? Listen, you have to calm down. It hurts, sobs Rayla, her fingers still tense around the swell of her belly. The baby. I know. It's okay. It's okay. She gives Callum a look, and suddenly Callum understands why Alis had asked him to let Rayla lean against him. Rayla, it's okay, he murmurs, pressing his lips onto the crown of her head, not entirely believing it himself. He kisses the space between her horns, whispers words of comfort into her hair, blinks back tears of panic and fear and anguish, because one of them needs to be strong right now, and it's not fair to expect her to be when she's the one in pain. I'm here, he mutters as Rowena scrambles for her bag of equipment. You're okay. Everything's okay. Princess, I need to have a look down here, okay, says Rowena, lifting the edge of her skirt. I need to see what's happening. It'll be a little uncomfortable, but bear with me for just a little bit. It'll only be for a moment. Can I do that? Rayla nods, a whimper caught in her throat, her muscles tense and shaking as Rowena takes a speculum from her bag, rubs it down with alcohol and lubricant, and ducks between her legs. Her grip around Callum's fingers tightens, and she lets out a cry when Rowena presses the instrument into her and shifts the lantern to have a look. Bleeding stopped, she mutters to Alis, removing the speculum. Princess, can you feel the baby? Is it still moving? Rayla sucks in a breath. I don't. I know it hurts, but you have to feel past that for me, says Rowena urgently. Can you feel the baby moving? She swallows, her eyes shut tight. When she opens them again, she nods. Alis. You got it. He draws a rune in the air over her belly, shimmering and orange, and mutters Mappa Sanguine Caloris under his breath. The rune glows, Callum winces against it and the way it sheds light on the blood smeared against the inside of Rayla's thighs, but it sinks into the swell of her belly and she gasps, her breath catching as it glows and settles under her skin. Rayla stills in his arms, and even in his panic, Callum feels the air leave his lungs, the shape of their baby visible as a whole for the first time in the incandescence of Alis magic. Its limbs are spindly and fragile, its head large and a little alien, but its heart is there, fluttering away, beating stubbornly in its tiny, luminous chest. In front of him, Rayla draws a shuddering breath, her grip and shoulders relaxing while Rowena traces the lines of light around her belly. Looks like a partial abruption, Alis mutters to Rowena, and she nods in agreement. Bub's not in any distress. Bleeding's stopped. Tetan is settling, but I think part of that was panic. I think we might be in the clear. The light fades, and Alis lets out a breath. Callum stares at them both. There's still a question hanging in the air that he's too terrified to ask, his heart beating so quickly in his chest that he's positive Rayla can feel it against her back, but Rowena smiles at them both. It's small, but it's reassuring, and her shoulders slump in relief as she sits back against her haunches. Your Highness, she says gently, shuffling forwards. Princess. Baby's okay. Baby's fine. We need to keep an eye on you for a few days in case anything else happens, but the baby's doing perfectly, all things considered. Callum's breath leaves him in a rush, and, in front of him, Rayla lets out a sob and pries a hand of his grip. She sets it tentatively against her belly, hardly daring to believe it, but the baby shifts against her hand. Callum sees it, a little wave of movement under the dark green fabric of her shift, too deliberate to be anything else. You're okay, manages Rayla hoarsely. There are tears in her eyes, and she's so relieved that she doesn't even stop them when they spill. You're okay, you stubborn wee thing. Taking after Mum already, mutters Callum. He presses another kiss into the crown of Rayla's head and breathes, trying to slow the hammering of his heart by reminding himself that she's there, and she's okay, and their baby's doing fine. Behind them, they hear Eleni let out a relieved sigh as well. Callum had almost forgotten she was still here, and he turns as best as he can to face her. Thank you, he murmurs. All of you, I mean. But you especially. If you hadn't, even before this, things might have. It's just my job, Your Highness, says Eleni with a little smile. I should head back. Make sure His Majesty's been made aware of what's happened and that he's safe. Please, says Callum. Thanks again. She nods, bows to them both, and steals a kiss from her husband's lips before she heads back out into the street. It's getting lighter out there, the sky a deep shade of blue through the mended glass of the story front window. For the first time, Callum catches sight of the bruises around Rayla's neck and peeking out of the neckline of her shift, dark, menacing patches of purple against the alabaster of her skin that remind him why they are here at all. Someone tried to kill her. Someone tried to kill her. The gravity of it hits him all at once and the relief in his system gives way to fury boiling away in the pit of his stomach. Someone tried to kill her, and if she hadn't been awake when she had been, they might have succeeded. Gods, they came so close that they almost lost their baby. It should scare him, he thinks, but he's had enough with being scared today, and it's barely even dawn. He sets his jaw. Holds Rayla to him in the tightest embrace he can muster, his own tears hidden amidst the sweat and the smoke in her hair. Rayla shudders against him, her thoughts and her emotions a veritable mess as she curls her fingers around his and sobs into their hands. They sit there for a moment, an exhausted, emotional heap, before she moves at last, trying to ease herself into sitting up on her own. The cry that slips from her lips almost sets him into a panic again, but Rowena eases her back down. It still hurts, she groans. Rowena nods. It will for a while, she says. And I'm afraid that means we have to restrict you to bed rest for the week, at least. You need time to heal. We can't go back to the castle, mutters Callum. Assassins broke in once. They'll do it again. I can't stay here, manages Rayla. If they want me dead, then we can't put Aelus and his family in danger. I won't. You can stay here the week you need to recover, says Aelus sharply, the authority of the healer he used to be evident in the way he stares them down. An abruption like this. I don't think I need to tell you how dangerous this was. We need to keep an eye on you, and we need to do it somewhere they won't think to look for you. Somewhere close and already protected by magic. That place is here. He's right, says Rowena, kinder than Aelus but still firm and closed to any further argument. Any unnecessary movement right now might make things worse. And, if it does get worse, we won't have a choice but to induce labor, and Bub's not ready for that yet. That makes Rayla swallow. She touches her belly once more, her fingers shaking and more afraid of anything than he's ever seen her. I'll put up some extra charms, Callum says at last. And as soon as you think it's okay, we'll find somewhere else. We're grateful for your hospitality, Aelus, but we're not putting you or your family in any more danger than we need to. That's considerate of you, says Aelus, his lips twitching. Eleni still has some of her maternity wear upstairs. I'm sure she won't mind if you borrow a dress or two, princess. Let's get you comfortable, I feel like it's going to be a long week. They draw a bath for her upstairs. Their bathroom is a little cramped, but Callum doesn't mind it. If anything, it's comforting that she's never further than arm's reach from him, if that. The bruises on her neck and on her chest are clearer than ever in the early morning light, but he doesn't look at them. Knowing that they are there, that those bastards came that close to taking her from him forever, only makes him furious, and she doesn't need that right now. Instead, he helps her wash up, helps her wash her hair, and clean the dried blood from her thighs, and scrub the sweat off her skin in the places she can't quite reach. She doesn't argue with him about it once. It's odd behavior for her, but given the events of the night, he doesn't really blame her. She lets him work in silence, never once complaining that about the fact that she's not an invalid, or that she can take care of herself, and when he helps her out of the bath, she clutches him for support and lets him tug the shift Aelus had laid out for her over her head. Are you okay? He asks her at last, his voice hardly louder than a whisper when he tucks her into Lesser's bed. Fine, she murmurs, refusing to look at him. She cuts herself off. I don't really want to talk about this. We don't have to, says Callum quickly. It's been a long night and I'm just glad you're okay. Both of you. Me too. Her fingers find his over the sheets, almost timid in their movements, but when she takes his hand, her grip is firm. She pauses, looking unsure how to phrase what she wants to say. It's okay. You don't No, says Rayla. There's strength in her voice now, and when he looks, he sees a fire in her eyes, stubborn and angry and unwavering in the face of this morning's events. I was scared, Callum, she admits quietly. Dangerously. Like if she wasn't confined to bed rest, she'd be tearing down the kingdom on her own in an effort to find the poor mistaken soul who tried to harm their child. I'm still scared. And I thought, for the longest time, that I was just afraid of water and of being a mother, but she sucks in a breath. I have never known fear like this. But you know what else? I'm pissed. Someone paid those bastards to kill me and our baby, and I'm willing to bet that same someone is riling up the people of Katolis. They have to go. For a moment, Callum stares. There's a part of him that wants to argue, but he's angry too. The bruising around her neck reminds him of that, and the grim determination set in the line of her lips is hard to rebuke. He gets it, really, he does, but she's still confined to bed rest, and even when Rowena gives them the all clear, he can't let her be part of the manhunt to find the worthless piece of shit that tried to have her killed, not when they put them in this position in the first place. Rayla, he starts gently. Please understand, you can't. I know I can't, she snaps. But you can. You're the most powerful archmage in the world. You can find them, and when you do, she winces as the baby kicks, probably a little too hard against her still tender womb, but the fire in her eyes burns even brighter still. Her grip around his hand tightens. Make them pay. Notes. Disclaimer, again, I'm not a midwife or a doctor, I'm just a scientist who works closely, enough, and in relative terms, with emergency and birth suite. Rayla has had a mild to moderate placental abruption, a condition in which the placenta partially separates from the lining of the uterus. It's one of the primary causes of vaginal bleeding in pregnancies later than 20 weeks, she'll be at 21-ish now, and can be caused by a range of things, but, in this case, trauma. There's not much to do in terms of treatment. If the placenta fully detaches, the only thing a doctor or midwife can do is induce labor if bub is old enough to tolerate it. Here, we're treading the line between mild and moderate, where Rayla's had a partial abruption but doesn't need immediate intervention, and where bub is in no distress and so doesn't need immediate delivery. Don't take my word for it though, I just hand out blood in the case that someone needs it, but Google is a cool thing. Apologies to any midwives or doctors who read this and know immediately if I screwed up. It's just a dumb pregnancy fic, guys, just let me have this, ha 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 ha. Chapter 14. Summary. She hates the idea, says Ez. Rayla. Having to hide from someone who tried to kill her. I'll bet she's furious. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 14. You'll wear a hole into the floor like that. Commander Gren says it, but it's his Aunt Amaya who means it. Ezran doesn't like the throne room at the best of times, it's cold and uncomfortable and far bigger than it needs to be, and it feels wrong to be here for anything other than ceremonial purposes. At most, he has council meetings here, and once a month, he uses it to hold court, but most days it stays empty. He has better things to do than sit in a chair within an empty room all day, and being a servant of the people is hardly something he can do from here. But it is, by far, the safest room in the castle. It's well guarded with only one way in or out with no hallways and shadows to hide in, and it's where he's been pacing since he was woken up before dawn this morning to be told that someone had hired assassins to murder of the Princess of Katolis. He's heard nothing from Callum. There's been no news since Eleni came back looking haggard and exhausted, her armor covered in blood. At the very least, he knows that Rayla and the baby are okay, but beyond that. He sighs and runs a hand through his hair, his circlet heavy on his brow. Aunt Amaya's been here too. He hadn't asked her to be, she'd come on her own, refusing to be anywhere but her nephew's side while her men and the rest of Ezran's crown guard comb through the castle, looking for people who look out of place and things don't quite fit. They've so far turned up nothing, which to him, suggests that their ranks haven't been infiltrated so much as they've been betrayed. It's that concerns him, because they already have a limited pool of people they can trust, and this only limits it more. Aunt Amaya's smile is grim, but there's an attempt at reassurance in it, even if there is a hardness in her eyes that betrays her otherwise collected demeanor. When she signs at him again, her words are kind. They're okay, as interprets Commander Gren. The baby too. They're all fine. But Ez scowls at her. It still happened, didn't it? He snarls. Someone tried to kill Rayla right under our noses, and they almost did. Gods, what if she hadn't been awake? What if Eleni hadn't been there? What if? What if S don't make a difference? He hears Gren say on her behalf. They are safe. All that we can do from this point is make sure that they continue to be, and you need a clear head to do that. Panicking won't help. I'm not panicking, Snap says, although yeah, now that he thinks of it, yeah he is. Personally he thinks it's a rather reasonable response, but Aunt Amaya's only trying to help, and it's not so becoming to snap at her when she's right. He takes a breath, trying to settle his thoughts and slow the still frantic racing of his heart. I'm sorry, he mutters, stopping at last. Besides you, they're the only family I have left. I could never forgive myself if. She smiles at him. It's closer to real this time, and there's something sort of maternal in it that makes Ez grateful for her patience. I understand. But you need to be strong now. You can't help them like this. She's right and he knows it. His thoughts are a mess, and while he knows in his head that Rayla and the baby are safe and okay, he's having trouble getting past the fact that someone attacked her to begin with. There has to be a response to this now, and he doesn't even know where to begin. Should he tell his people? Should they know that the castle was broken into, and that their princess was almost assassinated in her bed? Do they even have a right to know? What would that mean for Rayla? What would that mean for Katolis? What are they even supposed to do now? Ezran groans, and it feels like his circlet gets even heavier still. His father used to say he was lucky, to be born into the royal family of Katolis, to have the opportunity to live as comfortably as he does, and to have the power to effect change, but this sucks. The throne room doors creak open then, and when he looks, he sees Callum, still in his bedclothes with blood on his sleeves and an unhappy scowl on his face. He glares at the guards who escorted him, irritated that they felt the need to in the first place, and he waits until they bow out of the room and shut the doors after him before he storms across the throne room towards the dais. Ez meets him halfway, not quite so angry, but worried for him and wanting to help. How is she? He asks him quietly. Callum takes a breath. Okay, he mutters. Her and the baby, both. They are both. His voice cracks. His anger fails him. Ez does the only thing that makes sense, he pulls his brother into a hug, his arms tight around Callum's shoulders, his face buried into his chest. He doesn't ask any more questions. He just gives him time to think, and settle, and breathe. It's all he can offer right now. Callum's a wreck, and it's entirely reasonable for him to be. He'd nearly lost his wife and unborn child in one fell swoop, and Ez can't even imagine how much it kills him to be separated from them now. Callum shudders, and when he exhales against Ez's hair, it comes out with a sob. Vaguely, Ez hears the clanking of armor, and the next thing he knows is their aunt enveloping them both. It's comforting, to be surrounded all sides by the family that he has left, and he wishes Rayla were here too, because she probably needs it the most. She's fine, Callum whispers at last, more to himself, probably, than to Ez and Aunt Amaya. They are fine. They are both fine. They are too stubborn to be anything else, says Ez with a grim chuckle. And they are going to stay fine. I promise. You guys'll have your happily ever after, I swear it. Callum snorts a little in spite of himself, and when he pulls back, he rubs at his eyes with the heels of his hands and clears his throat with a cough. What are we doing, then? He asks, his voice firm, if a little hoarse. This bastard needs to go. Where do we start? Aunt Amaya responds first, but her hands are too quick for Ez to keep up. With the things we can do immediately, Gren says for her. My own soldiers are searching the castle. I'm concerned that there's a traitor amongst your guards, but until we can confirm that there is. She's not safe here, Callum finishes. We know. He pauses, glancing surreptitiously around the empty throne room. Things came really close to being really bad. We can't move her yet. Rowena thinks it might be a week before she'll be okay enough to travel, and even then, she can't go far. Her uncle's place would have been ideal, but, he grimaces. She hates the idea, says Ez. Rayla. Having to hide from someone who tried to kill her. I'll bet she's furious. Furious sounds about right, scoffs Callum. But she's come to terms with it, I think. She can't, we can't really afford to be stubborn about this. He huffs, wrinkling his nose at the dried blood on his sleeves, looking as if he'd rather she could be a meek railer in the face of danger like this is a foreign concept to all of them, but the blood on his sleeves is hers, Ez realizes, and the reality of how close she'd come to losing the baby hits him like a brick in the face. The thought makes him shudder. What about the Bantha Lodge, he suggests after a moment. It's out of the way, but only a day or so from here on horseback, if that. If we're discreet about who goes with her, no one would even know she's there. Aunt Amaya nods at him. It's a solid option, interprets Gren. Winter's a little way away yet. She could stay there until she has the baby, if she needs to. She'd be safe, and it'll give us time to find the— he makes a face at Aunt Amaya, scumbag he says pointedly, who tried to have her killed. Where are we on that front, exactly? Ez and Aunt Amaya share a look. We haven't found anything, he admits quietly. The assassins that broke in, they're all dead, thanks to you guys. There's nothing to say who hired them, and the guards at the gates and posted nearest your room don't remember a thing. But there had to have been a contact on the inside. This castle is huge, but somehow they knew the exact room you both were sleeping in. Someone had to have told them. Something dark crosses Callum's face, and it almost makes Ezran wince. He was there the day they won the war. He's personally seen Callum defeat stronger, more powerful enemies than some coward who ordered an attack on a pregnant woman, but he's never seen him like this. There's rage in the green of his eyes, it's merciless and unforgiving, and, most of all, terrifying, even to him. What are we waiting for, then, asks Callum shortly. If we find the traitor, we find this bastard. Let's start interviewing the guards. Ez swallows. Callum, he starts, but he falters, unsure what he even wants to say. He has every right and more to be as angry as he is, but Ez has never been scared of his brother, and he's not sure he wants to start now. I know you're angry, he says at last. But anger like this isn't such a good look for a prince, and Ambassador Gren finishes in Aunt Amaya's stead. Callum rounds on her unhappily. Are you asking me not to go and find the people who tried to kill my wife? I'm asking you to be patient, says Gren, his voice sharp, the way Ez imagines Aunt Amaya's voice would be if she could tell Callum off herself. You are under scrutiny from every single person in the 5 kingdoms, and it's unbecoming for a prince and ambassador, particularly one as powerful as yourself, to go looking for a fight. Let my men do this. You have a reputation to protect. Reputation, scowls Callum. Who cares about my reputation? Someone tried to have Rayla assassinated. What happens afterwards? Interrupts Ez quickly. If you go after whoever hired those assassins now, if you find them, what happens then? You and Rayla won't stop being ambassadors after this. People will still look to you to be an example of the peace you've both been working so hard to broker. He makes a face at his brother, halfway between scared and pleading. I know you're mad, Callum, and you have every right to be, but this person's trying to start a civil war. It won't help if you go looking for revenge. Let Aunt Amaya do this. Aunt Amaya nods at him. He's right, Callum. You know he is. This shouldn't be your first priority anyway. Your first priority should be making sure Rayla will be safe. Callum's anger fails him a second time because he knows it's true, and Ez sees it flash across his face. His grimace is guilty, especially when he looks down and catches sight of the blood on his sleeves once more. They'll get what's coming to them, Ez tells him. I promise you they will, and you'll be there when the time comes. Rayla too, and I swear that we'll never let anything like this happen ever again. This whole situation is delicate, and the last thing we want is for people to see their prince starting a civil war over this. For all we know, that's what they want. Please. Just be patient. Callum says nothing. His hands are balled into fists by his sleeves, his teeth bared together, and he has the look of someone trying really hard to stay civil. In the end, he huffs. Fine, he mutters darkly. That look is in his eye again, even if he does refuse to look at either of him. Find them, he bids Aunt Amaya. Also help me, I will. For his sake, almost hopes that he doesn't. A week and a half, Rowena says. A week of bed rest, and a half week of observation to make sure that Rayla can stand and walk on her own without complication. Callum sees her twice the whole time, afraid that going to see her more often might reveal her location and put her in more danger than she already is. The first time, it's to bring her things, her blades and her own clothes, and a letter from Ezran, apologizing profusely for not being able to see her himself. He'd argued when Callum told him he couldn't, but a king going out of his way to visit a little shop like this would arouse suspicion, and the last thing they need is for anyone else to know where she is when she can barely use the bathroom without being in pain. She'd looked sullen that first morning, obviously sick of being cooped up in Alis and Eleni's tiny apartment, being fussed over by everyone and waited on for everything, but she'd never once complained. The consequences of being stubborn about this are far too real to ignore, and as much as she hates being confined to bed, the baby comes first, and that's her decision and no one else's. The second time, it's to update her on their plans. She takes the decision to be sent into hiding at the Bantha Lodge without argument, agrees that she should travel there in the back of Ayla's merchant wagon, and only objects to being accompanied by some sort of guard because she doesn't know who to trust anymore. And, in all fairness, Callum thinks she's right. It feels stupid put her safety in the hands of soldiers, even Aunt Amaya's, when they've just been betrayed by one of their own, but it's stupider still to send her away without protection. What about us? Soren offers over lunch that day. Claude's and I can go with her. No offense, says Rayla dryly, but aren't you technically a cripple, and isn't Claudia a mage who can't do magic? Soren sneers at her. No offense, but aren't you pregnant with a kid you put at risk of losing every time you move? Rayla ducks her gaze at that. It's not like it's untrue, but it's never been presented so bluntly to her, to either of them, and it makes Callum's throat feel tight. He grips her hand under the table, squeezing her fingers until he hears her swallow her discontent with Soren. You're not exactly what you used to be, she says to him. If someone does find us, you're hardly in a position to. She takes a steadying breath, like she hates that she has to say it but knows she doesn't have a choice. Protect me. Actually, interrupts Alis. He bounces Turin in his arms, grinning at the way his son's eyes go wide at the lights he conjures between his fingers. I may have something to help with that. It's not a permanent solution, he adds sharply to Soren. But it may help the circumstances. When will you be leaving? As soon as Rowena's happy, says Callum. We're not waiting any longer than we need to. A couple of days then. Enough time to organize some things. Alis coos at Turin. Leave it with me, he says to Soren and Rayla. I have something for Claudia too. If you're happy for them to go with you, that is. They look to her for a decision, all of them, and in the end, Rayla sighs. Better them than anyone else, I suppose, she mumbles. It's a quick couple of days. It's like Callum blinks, and then they are gone, and Rayla will be the furthest from him than she has been in years, in the most vulnerable state of her life. The reality of it doesn't really set in until he gets to the wishbone before dawn that morning, when he spots her talking quietly in the back room with Rowena, his cloak over her shoulders, the ends of her blades peeking out of a little pack at her feet. Soren and Claudia are there already, both yawning over mugs of Claudia's hot brown morning potion, trying to look attentive while Alis goes over their plan once more. They are supposed to go first, under the guise of a hunting trip to help Soren in his recovery. Rowena will travel with Rayla in the back of Alis' wagon, and they'll rendezvous at the Bantha Lodge tomorrow afternoon when Alis drops them off on his way back to Zadia for more merchandise. It's risky. So risky. But the less people involved, the better, and Callum feels his stomach settle just a little when Alis hands Soren a sunfudge blade within its sheath, and a tiny bottle of potion. That's mine, he says sharply, pointing at the blade. It's yours to borrow until it's safe for Rayla to come back. That dash, he points at the bottle, is a potent serum. It'll give you enough strength and dexterity for about half a day if you get into a fight, but it'll put you into a wheelchair for a couple of days once that strength wears off. Do not use it lightly. When he turns to Claudia, he pauses. He studies her for a moment, like he's gauging her readiness for whatever it is he wants to give her, but in the end, he unlocks the chest in the back corner of the room and presents her with a box and a little book. I was going to assist you in making one when you were ready, he tells her, but the circumstances are dire, and you need it. What is it? Claudia yawns, but any traces of sleep disappear when she opens the box. Is this a primal stone? Aelus nods at her, a hint of pride in the smirk on his lips. It has moonlight from a full moon in it, and the book contains a number of spells. It was a gift from the elves in Lantha from a very long time ago. You'll find better uses for it than I will, at least in the immediate future. Aelus, I couldn't. You will, he says firmly. It's not a gift. It's a responsibility. You can't protect our princess and her little moonbeam without it, and I don't imagine His Highness would be pleased with you if anything were to happen to them. I wouldn't, says Callum at last. Thank you for doing this. I know it's a lot to ask. They blink at him like they've only just realized he's there, but Claudia grins, mutters a thank you to Aelus, and slips the glowing primal stone into her bag. You weren't asking, she says. We offered. And you know, after the trouble we put you and Rayla through in those early days, I feel like it's the least we can do. Callum smiles at them both, more grateful to them than he ever thought possible. Take care of her, okay, he says, opening his arms to hug one, and then the other. Swear to me she'll be safe. She will be, says Claudia. And just for your peace of mind, you can have this. She pulls her message mirror from her bag and presses it into his hands. You know how to use it, yeah? Just write into it, wherever you are, and Rayla will see it on hers and vice versa. We'll look after her, Callum. We promise. They shouldn't have to, grumbles Rayla, easing herself out of her seat. She winces a little, but she can walk now without too much trouble. Rowena trails after her awkwardly, but Aelus catches her shoulder and jerks his head at the back door. Give them some privacy, Rowie, Callum hears him say as he ushers her out to the wagon. We should probably get going too, says Soren. We'll see you at the lodge. Be safe, adds Claudia, hugging them both quickly. Keep in touch. We'll see you soon. They wave, and then they are gone. The little bell at the front entrance dings as they leave the shop, and then it's just him and Rayla, alone in the back room of the Wishbone, together for the last time before what will probably be months apart. He can't go with her. He'd come to terms with that when they made the decision to send her into hiding. He's needed here, as needs him here, to help quell a civil war before it even starts, and to help Aunt Amaya look for the coward who tried to have her killed in whatever way she'll let him. Visiting her will only give away her hiding place, and they know, they both do, that this is for the best. It doesn't hurt any less though. For a moment, Callum doesn't even have anything to say, and instead, he tugs her into his arms and holds her tight. I'm sorry it has to be like this, he murmurs into her hair, but Rayla shakes her head against his shoulder. Just find the person doing this, she says. The sooner you do, the sooner I can come back. He sighs against her, feels the baby shift in her belly and chuckles, pulling back to place his hands on the bump. It won't be for long, little one, he says. Make sure your mum doesn't do anything silly, okay? You and her have to be safe. In spite of herself, Rayla laughs. If only there was someone to make sure you did the same, she says, sad little smile on her lips. She pulls away from him for a moment, waddling carefully to her pack to pull her blades from it. Take these, she says, holding them out to him. They won't do me any good, but, if things go south here, if there's ever a point where you can't use magic, at least you'll have them. I can't leave you unarmed. I can't use them anyway. She chuckles ruefully, a hand resting on her belly. You can. Please. Just take them. Just be safe. Callum snorts, but he accepts them anyway and presses a kiss into her hair. In return, he unhooks the Anya's dagger from his belt and puts it in her hand. It saved your life once, he murmurs. It might do it again, if you need it. She nods, her voice caught in her throat, and Callum pulls her back to him, trying to remember the way she fits in his arms, trying to force the seconds to slow, to give them more time, but the back door swings open and Aelus clears his throat. We have to make a move, he tells them, and Callum sighs and nods into her hair. I love you, he mumbles, pressing a kiss to her lips. I know, whispers Rayla. I love you, too. Then her warmth is gone. Aelus ushers her through the back door and into the wagon. He climbs into the front, clicks his tongue at the horses, and the whole thing lurches into motion. Callum watches them go, a lump forming in his throat. Rayla peers out at him from the space in the canopy, the violet of her eyes glum and miserable, before it closes altogether and the wagon disappears into the streets. X. You told me it wouldn't fail, snaps the guard. He snarls at Balin, all but tossing his sword into the ground in his anger. You told me there would be nothing to implicate me, and now your assassins are dead. General Amaya's men are interrogating every guard, and Her Highness is being shipped away to gods only know where. Balin smirks at him. It's still early, barely past sunrise, and he understands the guard's frustration, but he's not foolish enough to divulge his whole plan to someone so easily angered. In all honesty, he thinks it's amazing that Amaya and her men haven't found him out yet. He's hardly discreet. Patience, friend, he says, his voice amused and oily. All things in good time. Is this a joke to you? Snaps the guard. This plan of yours is going to pieces. It already has. Has it? Balin asks, his smirk only growing wider. He slides his pile of maps to him and taps the little blip moving out of the city. Have a little faith. We're only just getting started. Notes. Shout out to Tumblr user at Cloudburst Paintwater who helped me work out a few kinks in my storyboarding. This one's going out to you. Chapter 15. Summary. Hear that, little one, she mumbles. Dad misses us. We miss him too, don't we? Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Part 3. 15. It's quiet at the lodge. Rayla wakes every morning to the sun as it shines on her bed, and to the earthy smell of autumn through open windows. It's getting colder now, the trees around the lodge are going bare, the brown and orange of their leaves littered all over the grounds, and there are days when the peace falls so heavily that even the hush of the nearby river fills her ears over the sounds of the lodge's other occupants. It's simple. Serene. Pleasant, even, compared to the hustle and bustle of life in the castle and on the road. But it also sucks, and every minute of it drags on far longer than it feels like it should. It had been something of a novelty at first. Rayla still remembers her first time here, and, despite the circumstances, she'd had a bit of a giggle to herself when they'd first arrived. It was followed up immediately by a longing for Callum. Of course, it's a little pathetic, if she does say so herself, but in her defense, she's hormonal, and at least Callum would get the joke. She'd met General Amaya for the first time in that room, had baked blind her men down there, had that standoff with her over by the river. It was considerably less funny at the time, but things have changed so much since that it borders on hilarious now. Callum had brought her here a second time a couple of years ago for good measure. It was in the winter, and he'd been rather insistent that she learned the Bantha Lodge's actual purpose. He had taken her sledding then, and had built snowmen and snow sylphs with her around back, and had taught her how to skate on the river after it had frozen over. She's pretty fond of those memories, and maybe one day, if they survive all this, they might come back with their little moonbeam and do the same. But that thought only makes the longing feel worse. They've been here 2 months now. The novelty has long since worn off. In all fairness, Rayla tries to remind herself, the quiet is good. Every day that nothing happens is a sure sign that they are safe. That had been the whole point, after all, to send her away somewhere quiet and hidden where no one would think to look for her and finish what those assassins had tried to start, but every day wears on and every day is the same. Soren whistles loudly when he goes on patrol every morning, coming back with rabbits from the traps set around the lodge in the afternoon. Claudia hums while she bakes and practices moon magic with her primal stone and her book of spells on the bank of the river. Rowena fusses over her, taking measurements and making notes and trailing after her like a concerned shadow. It's not that Rayla's growing tired of their company, they are her friends, and she'd much rather them over a retinue of soldiers she doesn't know or trust, but they are not Callum, and every time the baby moves or kicks against her palm makes her miss him more. She's just under 30 weeks along now, her gait is closer to a waddle, her back is sore, and her breasts tender, and she's grumpy a lot, both because she's hormonal and because she wishes there was something more she could do. She should be in the capital, with Callum and Ez. She should be helping them, in whatever way she can. She should be doing something to help find the bastard who tried to have her killed, or to stop rising tensions in the city. She shouldn't be here, hiding away because she's helpless and vulnerable and weak. She ends up sitting on the front steps, most days, message mirror in hand, waiting impatiently on news from Catullus and for the little drawings that sometimes appear in the glass. Today, it's a little doodle of her, belly round, flowers in her hair, little smile on her face, and a note. Tension rising in the other kingdoms now too. EZ's sending letters to the other leaders of the Pentachi for a summit on how to handle it. Still nothing on the assassination front. I'm sorry it's taking so long. I miss you both. It's a short message, but that's not so surprising. Things have only gotten messier since she left, and more than anything, it makes her wish she could help more. But she sighs, one hand running absently over the swell of her belly, the other pulling Callum's cloak tighter around her shoulders against the bitter wind. Hear that, little one, she mumbles. Dad misses us. We miss him too, don't we? The baby wriggles within her, not an answer in any way, but it's comforting, nonetheless. Her womb isn't so tender anymore, but sometimes it kicks a little too hard or squishes too much into her other organs that it's uncomfortable. It's a good thing, Rowena tells her. It's a sign that Bub's growing happily despite what those assassins had tried to do, and when it comes down to it, Rayla prefers this. As impatient as she is, as frustrated as she gets, as mad as being here makes her, her little moonbeam comes first, and she'd rather be stuck here than put it in any more danger. She wipes the mirror clean, makes an attempt at drawing Callum. It's a stick figure with a scarf, but it's the effort that counts, and writes him back. Just be safe. We miss you too. Any news? Rayla looks up. She fumbles with the mirror, tries to jam it into her pocket like it might reveal more weakness, but it's only Soren, his head tilted curiously at her with two rabbits slung over his shoulders. She shrugs at him and draws her knees to her as far as the bump will let her. Not anything new, she says with a sigh. Although there's tension in the other kingdoms now as well. Ez is calling a summit on it, so there's that, I guess. She purses her lips, turning the mirror over in her hands as Soren takes a seat on the stair in front of her. His recovery's come a long way. He's not exactly capable of hunting rabbits himself, and the charm on his belt is in no way a permanent solution, but at least he doesn't need his cane much anymore. He carries it with him most days, just in case, but lately he's been going out on patrol with just Ayla's Sunforge blade. It's about the same size as his cane, and Rayla's not sure Ayla's would be pleased that he's using it in its sheath as a backup walking stick, but she supposes it's better than having to carry them both. He sets the blade against the stair next to him and lounges back against the railing, the rabbits resting limp in his lap. This guy really wants to screw you over, huh, he says mildly. If it were anyone else, Rayla thinks she might have been annoyed with the bluntness of it, but she only snorts. Soren's sense of humor is strangely soothing. His inability to take anything seriously sort of highlights how truly stupid the situation is, and it eases the tension in Rayla's shoulders somewhat and brings a smirk to her lips. If by screw me over you mean, destroy everything we've ever worked for, then yes, she says dryly. She unhooks the dagger at her waist and hands it to him hilt first. That would be an apt assessment. He smirks back. Poor Princess Rayla, he drawls, unsheathing the dagger to start removing the first rabbit's fur. Chipped away like a helpless damsel, waiting for her handsome Prince Callum to do all the work for her. Rayla bristles, but her immediate response is snappier. You think Callum's handsome now, do you? You do, snorts Soren. Why, no one will ever know. He's still a scrawny little nerd who's never beaten me in a fight. It's unbecoming to pick a fight with a cripple. Soren barks out a laugh at that. He doesn't argue any further. It's true, after all, even with his charm and Ayla's Sunforge blade, it's not like he could do much damage to Callum, a fully fledged archmage who's not so bad with a sword anymore. Rayla had made sure of that. He sets the first rabbit down and starts on the second, brown fur collecting in the dry foliage at his feet. There's silence for a while. Soren works with his tongue between his teeth, and Rayla turns back to the mirror as it lights up in her hands and Callum's handwriting appears across the glass. How's our little moonbeam? Fine, she replies, chuckling a little at the way he pointedly doesn't erase her little stick figure of him. A little squirmy today. I think it's as impatient to be out in the world as me. Not yet, little one, comes Callum's reply, a little frowny face drawn at the end of the sentence. It's still too early, and there's no way I'm missing the birth of my first child. Better catch the guy quick then, writes Rayla, her smile falling at the reminder of how weak she's become. Soren must catch it. A sort of understanding flashes in his eyes, but he waits until Rayla puts the mirror away before he says anything about it. I totally get it, by the way, he says quietly, finishing his work on the second rabbit. Not being able to help when it feels like you should be, I mean. It's frustrating. Rayla raises an eyebrow at him. Is this supposed to be some sort POW wow? He gives her a look. You can't be strong all the time, you know. For a second, Rayla doesn't even know how to respond. She stares, a little bewildered that this talk is coming from Soren, of all people, but the more she thinks about it, the more it makes sense for it to be. He knows how it feels to be helpless out of the blue. He knows how frustrating it is to watch everyone else do your work for you. If there's anyone at all who can understand how much she hates being stuck here when she should be in the city with Callum, it's him. This is different, she mutters at last. Is it? Yes, says Rayla sharply. I'm not stuck out here because I can't protect myself. I'm here because I need to protect the baby. And because you can't protect yourself. Soren smirks at her, even as a scowl fixes itself onto her lips. You can't be strong all the time, but accepting your limits doesn't make you weak either. That literally doesn't make any sense. Soren snorts at her. I thought you'd be the smart one between the two of us, he drawls. Excuse you. He heaves a sigh, long and patient, like he's trying to explain something to a child. It makes Rayla want to hit him, honestly, but the words that come out of his mouth are hardly words she'd ever thought she'd hear from him. It's not about strength, Rayla, he tells her. If this guy wants you dead, then you need to play smarter than this, and knowing when to pull out of a fight because you can accept your limits isn't weak. It's smart. You can trust me on that. I would know. He sheaths the dagger and holds it back out to her, rolling his eyes as if he can't believe he had to be the one to tell her something so stupidly obvious. He gets up when she takes it, dusts the remaining rabbit fur off his armor, and unlatches his cape. Don't stay out here too long, he says, dropping it over her shoulders. The cold's not so good for the baby. He steps back into the lodge without another word, his footsteps heavy against the wood, and Rayla lets out a sigh, her breath unfurling in front of her like fog. He's right, of course, and it irks her. You know things are dire when Soren's making sense, she mutters to her belly. The baby shifts. It's the worst 2 months of Callum's life. Tensions have only grown worse since Ez told their people of what happened the night of the attack, because where elves had been tolerating the injustice before, now they are fighting back. The arguments in the streets are getting violent, shops have been broken into and merchants, both elven and human, have been attacked on their way in and out of the city. There's suspicion between EZ's own soldiers because no one knows who to trust. And still, they have no leads on who paid assassins to try and kill Rayla in the night. Aunt Amaya had said to be patient, but every day that passes without new developments frustrates Callum more. Every guard's been interrogated and interviewed, and he's tried using magic, even, to replay the events of the night, but there's nothing. Not a hint or even a whisper of who to blame. At the very least, he knows Rayla and the baby are safe. He keeps Claudia's mirror on him at all times and writes into it whenever he can. He misses her. This is the longest they've ever been apart, and he thinks, maybe, this situation wouldn't feel so bad if he at least had her to help him get through it. Nothing ever feels as difficult when he's with her, and more than anything, he wishes he could take a break from all of this, to clear his head and to be with her, just for a few days. But he doesn't do that. Seeing her at a time like this will put her in danger, and, even more, Ez needs him here. Ez needs him now more than ever, because this is absolutely not what they intended when they opened the border to Xadia, and when Callum married Rayla in the first place. Catolis was supposed to be a haven, a beacon of peace and friendship between elves and humans, and sure, they weren't expecting it to be easy, but they weren't expecting this either. It makes him mad. Not even because it's ruining all the work they've done these past 4 years, but because sowing civil unrest in a time of peace takes effort, far more, at this point, than just enjoying it. How much does someone have to hate elves to pull this kind of thing? How terrible a person does someone have to be to want this? There are anti-elf sentiments in the other kingdoms now, and that angers Callum more because he knows those sentiments came from here. Letters from the other monarchs have arrived, growing more and more anxious about the civil unrest in their lands, but it's not until Anya expresses her concern that Ezran calls for a summit. They have a pretty large population of elves there too. Duran's common border with Xadia is by far the largest, and after Ezran opened up theirs, it only made sense to Anya to follow suit. Duran's had a better go of it so far, but the more elves, rightfully, retaliate against humans, being hostile, the more other humans are starting to worry. Callum gets it. Really he does. He understands why the elves that have made Katolis their home are starting to fight back, understands why the humans here, and elsewhere throughout the Pentarchy, are tense and anxious, but it's not helping, and there are only so many peaceful measures they, as monarchs, can do. They arrive at the confluence of Kings early. It's a day's ride from the capital, and Rayla's absence is glaring, at least to him. It seems wrong to be discussing elf-human relations without an elven representative present, but beggars can't really be choosers at this point, and they'll just have to make do. Ez climbs a little clumsily off his horse looking haggard and exhausted, his lips pulled into the semi-permanent frown that's taken up residence on his face. The only other person here so far is the newly minted King Kasef and his advisor, the same one that served his father before his retirement, Callum thinks. King Ezran greets Kasef crisply. He looks irritable, like he'd rather not be here at all, and as if his advisor had forced him to come. How good to make your acquaintance at last. The same to you, says Ez, bowing his head. How are things in Neolandia? Better than in Katolis, says Kasef importantly. Proudly. Like it's an accomplishment to have kept the peace in Neolandia when Neolandia barely has a population of elves to begin with. He turns to Callum. My belated congratulations to you and your wife, he adds, his voice snide. How far along is she now? Callum shifts his shoulders, his patience with Kasef already wearing thin. 30 weeks, he answers, squashing the pang of guilt in his gut. Gods, he misses Rayla. I've been told that things are going well despite the, he clears his throat. Earlier complications. I didn't think humans and elves could have children together. Kasef wrinkles his nose. Is it much different from lying with a human? Ez holds his arm up, catching Callum in the chest before he even registers the way he'd started forwards, his fists balled at his sides, Rayla's blades heavy in their sheaths at his back. With all due respect, King Kasef, Her Highness, says Ez sharply, a not-so-gentle reminder to Kasef that Rayla is every bit as royal as him now, wouldn't approve of this discussion. In any case, I'm not sure how you would know what lying with anyone feels like to begin with. He sneers at him. Would you excuse us for a moment? He steers Callum away, his fingers firm against his elbow. Breathe, he murmurs. Kasef's an idiot. He always has been. It's fine, snaps Callum. His temper's been shorter these days, honestly, who can blame him, but Ez is right. Kasef's never been particularly well behaved, not even when his father was king, and Callum can think of more than one visit to Neolandia that had taken more patience than he and Rayla had combined. He sucks in a breath, his fingers finding their way the mirror in his pocket. Rayla's little stick figure of him is still in the glass, but there's a new message today, it must have appeared while they were riding in. Hope the summit's not too dry. 10 silver, says Kasef. Can't go the whole day without saying something stupid. Give Anya our best. He snorts loudly and holds the mirror up to Ez. Guess I owe her 10 silver. It's an otherwise quiet wait after that. Queen Farida of Evenir arrives next, brilliant red hair shining in the sun, then King Florian of Delbar and his daughter, Livanna, in the place of his advisor, and then at last, Queen Anya herself, perhaps the only other monarch present who looks as tired as Ezran. My apologies for being so late, she says, her tone clipped and short, impatient and eager to get on with this meeting in the same way Ez is. Her people are having issues too, after all. Her eyes are hard, and her smile is unfriendly, particularly to Kasef, but it softens a little when she catches Ez and Callum's eye. She takes her seat in front of the emblem of Duran. Let's not waste any time, shall we? Let's begin. Notes. Kinda feeling like this is a mess, but also so is my roster, so y'all can blame that if this sucks. Feel like it's time for a breather anyway, and we need to sort of establish what's been going on during this 2-month time skip. Plot will pick up again next chapter, I promise. But also a big shout out to @Art2 Animation over on the Raylum Discord server. I don't know if you ever got my response, but your art was beautiful and I may have cried a little. Also shout out to Tumblr user at the Confuser for letting me rant about a specific plot point that may or may not make it into this fic, you know, the one winking smiley. Chapter 16. Summary. What dagger? Chapter text. 16. In the 4 years since the war ended, a summit's only ever been called 3 times. The first was immediately afterwards. Xadia and the Pentachi had been at odds with each other for so long that no one had really known how to proceed in an era of peace. To Es, it had been obvious: remove their troops from their strongholds at the breach as a show of goodwill, and arrange a number of treaties and agreements to foster friendship between their two halves of the continent. It had been unheard of, then, to have other people present at a meeting of monarchs, but Es had insisted, so Callum and Rayla were there. Who better than to propose the idea of friendship than the two people who ended the war together to begin with? At the time, the other monarchs were hesitant. Even Anya seemed dubious about removing her troops from her own borders with Xadia, and Rayla's very presence in the room had put the other kings and queens of the Pentachi on edge, but they had to start somewhere, so even with their resistance, Es had gone ahead and done it anyway. For a while, nothing had happened. Aunt Amaya's troops stood down and came home, but no elves came with them. Understandable, Es had thought. It was always going to take time before both peoples got used to the fact that the war was over and that friendship was possible. Callum and Rayla were living, breathing proof of it, but it would take time, nonetheless. Then they started traveling together as ambassadors and things became easier. Humans crossed the border in a bid to learn magic. Elves crossed it, curious about human invention. Things went well enough, all things considered. There was still resistance, sure, but that was always to be expected, and Es is honestly surprised that they hadn't run into more. The second time a summit was called, it was just to assess their progress as a whole. Catolis was thriving at the time. People were still distrustful of elves, but there was no denying the fact that magic had made things easier. People were sick less, and when they were, they got better quicker. Infrastructure improved because of the combination of human ingenuity and magical reinforcement. Knowledge was shared between both sets of common folk, and the future of EZ's people became brighter in every possible way. It was the same in Duran. Anya had opened up her borders about a year after Es had watched her neighbor's growing friendship with Xadia and had decided Duran might benefit from it too. Florian, Anderling, and Farida were still hesitant, but at the very least, Rayla's presence at that second meeting wasn't met with the same hostility as the first. To be fair, she and Callum had done a fair bit of traveling by then. They were acquainted enough with the other monarchs that it was less strange to have an elf in the room, and while elves and humans still disagreed with, screamed at, each other at negotiations and treaty signings, things were better. It wasn't, by any means, smooth sailing, but the progress was there. His people were healthy, and for the most part happy, their economy and their granary unfazed by the growing population. Things were well and truly good, and the concept of peace and friendship came closer and closer to becoming reality. Then this happened. Arguments in the streets led to bricks being thrown through windows, led to fires being lit and properties broken into, and one failed assassination attempt had people back at each other's throats. It'd be fine, Es thinks, if it was just Catolis. But the problem is that it's not. Ideas have spread too far, and even the elven population in Duran is at odds now with Anya's people. Florian is considering closing his borders entirely, and Farida and Kasef, whose lands don't have much of an 11 population to begin with, don't want to open their borders at all. It was always going to come to this, snorts Kasef, slumping lazily in his seat. What did you think was going to happen? That everyone would just bury their differences overnight? They did, sneers Ezran. Not overnight, maybe, but 1 in 3 women don't die in childbirth anymore, at least not in Catolis. Things were going fine. And yet, here we are. Kasef shakes his head. Maybe you had my father considering it, but frankly, I don't see why Neolandia should bother. No one's forcing you to open your borders, says Anya crisply. But your hostility isn't helping. Things were better. There was proof of it in Duran as well. But we need to handle this as a whole, or we risk starting another war. With whom? Ourselves. Kasef actually laughs. How do you know this wasn't their plan in the first place? What if Xadia wants us to fight between ourselves until they can pick us off one by one? Ezran scowls at him, the king in his demeanor faltering for just a moment. Are you actually being serious? He has a point, King Ezran says Farida quietly. Fighting on our side of the continent makes us weaker, and if tensions were ever to escalate with Zadia again, we'd be weak to attack. What attack? Demands Ezran. There's peace between us right now, there's no reason to suspect anything like that. The only thing that sort of thinking does is spread distrust, which is the problem. On Duran's side of the chamber, Anya purses her lips. With all due respect, King Ezran, she says. It would be naive not to have some sort of contingency plan for if something like that does happen. Not you too. But she adds sharply. I believe you're right. The problem is the fact that our people don't trust each other anymore, and that has to be addressed before anything else. Turning elves away won't fix the problem, and closing borders to them will make it worse. Kasef groans. Farida and Florian glance at him, stern and disapproving of his behavior, but they don't object. If anything, they look just as concerned as he does, just less childish. What, exactly, are you proposing we do? Duran and Katolis have this problem, not us. As far as Neolandia's concerned, it's safer for us to keep our borders closed to elves. That's exactly the sort of thinking that perpetuates the problem, says Anya. She rolls her eyes and lets out a patient sigh, but when she looks up again, she looks at Callum. What we lack is perspective. How is Zadia responding to this, Prince Callum? Callum blinks at her. He clears his throat, his mind obviously elsewhere, his hand in his pocket, probably holding the message mirror within it tight within his fingers. They're concerned, he says after a moment. The elves in Alon share your sentiments, King Kasef. It's made our job difficult, in all honesty, but I believe continuing that behavior will only be problematic for both sides of the border. I agree, says Ez. This needs to be controlled, and continued hostility from us as rulers is the opposite of that. It needs to be controlled peacefully, corrects Anya. At most, we should be maintaining the granaries and treasuries. Show that there's plenty to go around and our economies aren't in danger. Beyond that, the only thing I believe we should do is prevent violence. That's barely anything, says Ez, frowning. Surely there's more we can do to discourage those ideas. The severity in Anya's eyes slips. You can't tell them what to think, as she says. When it comes down to it, humans are your people before elves are, and you can't turn against them in a bid for peace no matter how wrong they are. She glances at the other monarchs, blinks at them like she's only just remembered they are still in the room, and sighs. This as good a time to have a break as any. I move to adjourn this meeting for the time being. We can continue this afternoon. X. In hindsight, we probably didn't need a full summit. Ez glances up. He's sitting on the steps of the Confluence of Kings, away from the other monarchs, away from Callum, even, who's sequestered himself into a corner with Claudia's message mirror and pining over Rayla. It's not such an odd thing for him, they've never really been apart for this long, and given the circumstances, Ez gets it. He should be there with her, or at the very least, she should be here with him, and they came so close to losing their unborn child that it's kind of understandable that he spends his every waking moment fussing over her in the very limited way that he can. He snorts and shuffles over a bit to let Anya sit down. She does, her knees together and her ankles crossed, her fingers settling primly in her lap with the grace and finesse no 14-year-old should even have the right to have. It's a subtle reminder to Ez that she's been doing this far longer than he has, and that she's probably wiser and better at it in every way. How's your brother? Ez snorts a second time and jerks his head at Callum, still hunched over in the corner, probably doodling into the glass. He's losing his mind over how much he misses his wife, but you know. What can you do? Anya lets out a laugh, a tinkling, bell-like sound that reminds him of the chimes in the Hall of Ceremonies. How's Her Highness, then? You can just call her Rayla, you know. That would be impolite. She rolls her eyes good-naturedly. Seriously? How is she? Bored, probably, chuckles Ez. He glances at Callum again and shrugs. But otherwise, doing really well considering, he trails off uncertainly. Rayla's a sister to him in all but blood now, and what happened that night isn't a particularly pleasant memory. He clears his throat. I just want them to have their baby in peace. All they've done since the end of the war is work, and just when we thought things were finally working out, all this happened. We made it work last time, says Anya, nudging his elbow lightly. We can make it work again. It just, takes time. Kinda needs people like Kasef to get their heads out of the sand too, just saying. Bet you he literally doesn't even know what that expression means. That makes Ez laugh, his frustration fading little by little. Duran's always been Catullus' closest ally, both because they are the buffer between Zadia and the rest of the Pentarchy, and because they have a long history of helping the other out. It's no different today, and it certainly helps that Anya knows what it's like to be so young and thrust into a role with so much responsibility and power. It's probably why they get along so well. She's level-headed but marginally less open to change, and Ez is open to change, but marginally less level-headed. It's a delicate balance of sorts. He's learned a lot from her over the years he's been ruling, and she from him, and he's glad that he can call her his friend beyond the formalities of ruling their respective kingdoms. We probably didn't need a full summit, he agrees at last. But things are changing whether Kasef and the others are ready for it or not. They need to be involved in things like this. That's probably true, says Anya mildly. She takes in a breath, and when it comes out again, it does so with a sigh. They are within their rights to keep their borders closed. You know that, don't you? Even if they are wrong, if King Kasef and Queen Farida don't want to open their borders to elves, and if King Florian wants to close his, that's their prerogative. Ez scowls a little, but he knows she's right. She usually is about this sort of thing. It's just dumb, he mutters. How's anyone supposed to foster peace if leaders of entire kingdoms think like this? It's only been 4 years, Ez says Anya gently. They need time to adjust. And, maybe once King Florian retires, Princess Livanna will be easier to convince, but the point is you can't force anyone to accept your ideas, even if they are good ideas. That's just the way of politics. HMEZ's lips twitch a little. You've grown wise, Your Majesty, he jokes. Bold of you to assume I once wasn't, snorts Anya. Enough of this. We can discuss it until our ears bleed this afternoon. I'm going to go and talk to your brother. Care to join me? Ez pauses, turns his head just a little to catch Callum, still in the corner, still hunched over the mirror, still fussing over Rayla. Yeah, he says finally. Might do him some good to talk to someone face to face. Callum. So was I right? How long did Kasef go without saying something dumb? Not even a whole minute, writes Callum with a snort. It's been 2 hours and I probably owe you 50 silver already. Hey. Callum. Callum starts. He deactivates the mirror, shoves it into his pocket and straightens, a poor attempt to look a bit more like the prince he's supposed to be, but an attempt nonetheless, but it's only Ez and Queen Anya looking various shades of amused. Your Majesties, he greets, more to Anya than to Ez. He offers them both a bow. What I can do for you both? There's no need for that among friends, says Anya with a smile. I just wanted to say hello. Ez tells me Her Highness is doing well. She is, says Callum, his hand going to his pocket once more like the mirror is a physical reminder of it. He looks between them curiously, wondering how long Anya's been familiar enough with his brother to call him Ez when she's always been the epitome of formality. He shakes it off in favor of the conversation at hand. She says hello, by the way, and that she's sorry she couldn't say so in person. She doesn't have to apologize, chuckles Anya. I always liked her. She has the best sense of humor. Say hello from me as well, won't you? Tell her that I expect you both to be in Duran sometime soon. I don't imagine I'll get much of a chance to meet your. She pauses and glances at Ezran. Little Moonbeam. Yeah, he mutters, grinning at his shoes. I don't imagine I'll get much of a chance to meet your little Moonbeam otherwise. You could tell her yourself, says Callum. He offers her the mirror, feeling the corners of his lips tilt upwards. She'd probably appreciate hearing from someone else. Oh. You just have to write into it, Ez tells her, activating it for her. Rayla's got the other one. She'll see whatever you say. Don't mind if I do then. Anya grins, and Callum catches his brother's eye over her shoulder and quirks an eyebrow. Ez just shrugs at him, peering over her shoulder and smirking at whatever Rayla writes that makes her laugh. It's nice, Callum thinks, to be able to act like Rayla's pregnancy is just a normal pregnancy, like she's just at her uncle's, or at the castle, because she's grown too big to travel, and not because she's gone into hiding just to stay safe. It's a pleasant change from the weeks of worry and anger and fear that's had him pacing corridors and chasing down leads in the capital. Which, unfortunate as it is, reminds him that he owes Anya a debt of gratitude. "Thank you, by the way," he says after a moment. "For the gift you sent us. That dagger saved her life that night. I don't know where we'd be without it." Anya's smile falters as she passes the mirror back to him, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "What dagger?" Callum blinks. "The one you sent us after Ayres first announced." He blanches. "You didn't send it." The flicker of confusion turns into a frown and Anya shakes her head. "I sent you a little bow and arrow. I thought Her Highness might appreciate it, but I don't know anything about a dagger." "But then who?" Callum swallows, the obvious conclusion there intangible, but he thinks his brain might have stopped working altogether. His mouth goes dry. His stomach drops through the floor. He thumbs the edge of the mirror and finds Anya's last message hasn't been erased yet, and moon and stars, that can't mean. Oh my gods. The conclusion dawns on EZ's face faster than it does on Callum's, his face paling even in spite of the darkness of his skin. "You have to go," he tells Callum. "Hurry." Callum doesn't even nod. "Excuse me, Your Majesty," he says to Anya hoarsely, and then he's off. He practically leaps off the steps of the Confluence of Kings, wiping the mirror clean as he goes and writing in clumsy, hurried letters. "The dagger's not from Anya. Get rid of it. Please let her get it," he thinks as he sprints down the path and back to Kuritsa, who's waiting by the guards at the bottom of the hill. "Please don't be too late." Rayla doesn't answer. Chapter 17. Summary. "You want to kill me? Give it your best shot." Chapter text. 17. Today begins as quietly as all the others. Rayla wakes to dappled sunlight on her face and to the chill of autumn in the air. Rowena assesses her and the baby's growth, making note of it in her little book. Claudia bakes and practices moon magic by the river, and Soren goes on patrol in the late morning to make sure their position hasn't been given away. Rayla's grown pretty used to the routine of it, but she's bored out of her mind, and reminding herself that boredom and safety are synonymous with each other is getting old. The only new thing is the occasional spasm in her belly. Rowena says that it's normal, that it's her body's way of getting ready to deliver the baby, but it only reminds Rayla of how close things are getting. It's not unheard of for babies to arrive as soon as 1 month early, particularly elf-human babies, and it makes her nervous, because it's been 2 months since she went into hiding and Callum still hasn't found any reliable leads on who tried to kill her. She doesn't blame him at all. He's been busy. He's at the Confluence of Kings today with Ayres to discuss the rising tensions between elves and humans on this side of the border, and he's probably having a worse time than her, judging by the messages he's been sending. She's just tired of hiding, and she misses him, and he's determined not to miss the birth of his child, which doesn't really want to have to do until there's a guarantee that it's safe. Frankly, there's nothing worse than the idea of having to go into labor knowing how vulnerable she'll be while there's someone overtly trying to kill her and her baby, no matter how well hidden they are. The late morning finds her on the front steps again, mirror in hand, Callum's cloak over her shoulders, heavy blanket over her knees. Soren's still out, but the smell of fresh bread wafts out through the kitchen window and makes her stomach grumble beneath the movements of the child in her belly. Claudia's always been a pretty good cook, and the little moonbeam has loved every second of being stuck out here, if only because Claudia's happy to oblige even the weirdest of cravings, and Rayla considers, for a moment, heading inside for some lunch when the mirror lights up with Callum's handwriting. They must be on a break, she thinks as she reads over his scrawl, practically hearing his frustrated whine in the words on the glass. She responds with a joke, "So was I right? How long did Kasef go without saying something dumb?" Hoping it might settle his nerves a little, and lets out a giggle when he responds in kind. "Not even a whole minute. It's been 2 hours and I probably owe you 50 silver already." "That's not surprising," writes Rayla, pleased. She might not be able to do much, but making sure Callum keeps his head on straight during meetings like this must count for something. There's no response for a moment. Rayla figures he might be caught up in conversation with someone else, and she turns the mirror over in her hands patiently while she waits, But when it does light up again, the letters are finer, and loopier, and unmistakably in Queen Anya's hand. Hello Princess. Her writing reads. I'm sorry things have turned out like this. I'd hoped to see you at the summit, but I hope everything's going well wherever you are. Come and visit Duran soon. I'm so excited to meet your little moonbeam. All the best, Anya. Isn't she sweet, laughs Rayla, more to the baby than to anyone else. It's refreshing to hear from someone else for a change, and, in spite of the circumstances, she grins. It's no wonder she and your Uncle Ez get along so well, hey. To Anya, she writes, Hello Your Majesty. I apologize for not being able to liven things up over there myself. You'll have to make do with my poor husband, I'm afraid, even if he isn't quite as funny as me. The mirror wipes clean after a moment. Your poor husband just misses you. You're so lucky to have him. He loves you very much. Rayla chuckles at that because she knows it's true. She is lucky to have him, and she knows how much he loves her because he'd spent every day since he first told her making sure she'd never forget. She raises a hand to clear the glass again, but she pauses, hand stilling in the air, response forgotten, when she spots Soren hobbling out of the wood, out of breath and stumbling over his own feet. Rayla frowns. She pockets the mirror, untangles her knees from the blanket and waddles down the steps to catch him as his knees begin to shake. What happened? She demands, putting his arm over her shoulder to catch his weight. Are you okay? What's going on? Soren swallows, his feet dragging a little as she helps him up the steps and into the lodge. We have to go, he manages. There are people camped nearby. They know you're here. X. What do you mean they know she's here? How could anyone possibly know she's here? Does it matter how? They know and they are planning to attack at nightfall. We have to move. Where? Even if we started moving now, we wouldn't get very far. The yelling is giving Rayla a headache, and the way the baby shifts and wriggles in her belly isn't helping. She's pacing in the kitchen while Claudia and Soren argue over each other over the counter because they are both right. She and Soren are in no shape to defend themselves, but they are in no shape to travel either, and even if they were, where would they go? The nearest town is a day's ride along the riverbank, more, because it's too risky for Rayla to ride any faster than a brisk walk. They won't get far before whoever's coming realizes they are not here and tracks them down anyway, but staying here isn't an option either. Soren has one vial of potent serum that might give him the strength he used to have, but its after effects will leave them even more vulnerable, and it's not like they can stay at the Bantha Lodge once their cover's been blown. They are screwed either way, Rayla thinks. Callum's the only one they can contact so immediately, but he's 2 days away on horseback, and even if there was some way they could contact anyone else, there's no way they would get here in time. Over by the far wall, Rowena swallows. She looks between Rayla and Soren and Claudia, wanting to help but unsure how, wanting to share an opinion but doubtful of how valuable it might be when their options are so clear-cut. Rayla skulls. They are wasting time like this. They have to decide on a course of action now. She takes a breath. Forces herself to slow the racing of her thoughts and of her heart and take it one step at a time. She reaches into her pocket for the mirror as a comfort, but when she pulls it out, Anya's writing is gone and Callum's is back again with 2 hastily scribbled sentences she has to squint at to read. The dagger's not from Anya. Get rid of it. Rayla's breath hitches in her throat. Her eyes drift to the dagger, sitting heavy and ominous on her hip. She tugs it off her belt, unsheathes it to study the blade and the hilt and the inside of the sheath, and there. There's a dim glow in it, barely perceptible at all, but it's there. She swallows, flips the dagger in her hand and uses the blade to tear through the leather, peeling it apart one broken seam at a time until it falls open and useless in her hands. There's a rune in the lining, purple and glowing, something so obviously imbued with dark magic that Rayla almost drops it in disgust. Shut up, she snaps at last, rounding on Soren and Claudia. She tosses the broken sheath onto the counter between them and slams the end of the dagger into the wood. What the hell is that supposed to be? Claudia falters, recognition crossing her face before she steps back entirely, almost afraid to be too near to it. That's a tracking rune, she says quietly. I don't understand, has made dark magic illegal, how could anyone? The attempted assassination of the Princess of Katolis is considered illegal too, snorts Soren. Somehow I don't think they have any problems with illegality. Can you break it? Claudia hesitates. Something like fear crosses her face, but she picks up the broken sheath anyway with shaking fingers. She brings it to eye level, examines the way it glows and how it's been pressed into the leather before. At last, she nods. I can cloak it, she murmurs. Or we can destroy it. It's a simple spell, I think. It just shows its location on a map the original enchanter has, but it's not something I can just, break, at least, not without dark magic. She shudders and sets it down again. But I can cloak it. What are you waiting for, then, snaps Soren. Do it. There's no point, says Rayla sharply, because there's not. Whoever it is who wants her dead is already here, and, if what Soren overheard is true, they'll attack at nightfall whether they are ready for them or not. But her mind is racing again. Why now? She wonders. They've been here 2 months and she's had the dagger the whole time. Before then, Callum had it, and there were plenty of opportunities to attack while they were on the road. Why not before? Why now? Pack up, she says shortly. Get the horses ready. We're leaving. But, Your Highness. That's Rowena. She looks scared, and her eyes flit to Rayla's belly briefly, a reminder that any jerky movements, like that of a galloping horse, will put the baby at more risk than it already is. Rayla offers her a grim smile. We don't have a choice, Rowie, she says quietly. What we need is more time. I can buy us some, I think. But we... Woe, interrupts Claudia. What do you mean you can buy us some? What, exactly, are you intending to do? Rayla hesitates. Her heart is hammering away in her chest, but what choice do they have? They can't fight, and they can't run, but they have to do something, they just have to be clever about it. She catches Soren's eye and feels her lips quirk into a smirk, a nervous one, but a smirk nonetheless. I'm playing smart. Nightfall doesn't come soon enough for Balin and his men, but it comes all the same, and his fingers are almost twitching with glee. He's been plotting and waiting and sitting on his hands on this for more than a year now, and victory has never felt so close. In some ways, he feels like he's already won. It's been so good to watch the prince and his whore of a princess scrambling for purchase as the world they build crumbles before their eyes, but this is truly the icing on the cake. To be able to personally exact his revenge on the elf, to have her know it was him, the whole time, as civil war erupts around them and as she loses everything at his feet. He breathes in the night air, lets it fill his lungs and invigorate him before he turns to his men. There are 20 of them tonight, some of them his closest followers from their days at the castle, before Ezran foolishly dismissed them all without so much as a trial. He'd been right to, Balin supposes. They would have turned on him the moment Balin gave them the order, and maybe Catullus would be in worse shape if he hadn't. But they are just as mad as he is, and they are more than ready for bloodshed tonight. He whistles, has them douse their torches and soften their footsteps, swords at the ready as they creep through the wood and towards the lodge. His informants at the castle had told him no guards had been assigned to missions regarding the protection of their supposed princess, and he'd gone to the trouble of waiting for the new moon, so he knows defense here will be minimal tonight. But still, he's not dumb enough to believe the prince would have sent her away without some sort of guard, magical or not. But when the lodge comes into view, his men falter, not because there is a guard, but because there isn't one at all. The grounds are empty. The windows of the lodge are dark and there's nothing, no smoke from the chimney stack, no tracks, and no horses, just a single figure waiting for them on the steps, one knee crossed over the other, his dagger between her fingers. The elf. Balin holds his men, a smirk playing on his lips as he steps towards her and draws his sword. Good evening, princess, he drawls. How lovely to see you. The elf snorts, an almost smirk gracing her features. General Balin, she greets without getting up. Of course. I should have known better. You should have, sneers Balin, stepping closer. You and your prince never should have crossed me. Technically, he's your prince, she says. He's my husband, but I'm only a citizen of Catullus by marriage, so he was never really my prince. Get it? She rolls her eyes at him, amused, and something like fury flares in Balin's gut. How dare she taunt him under such circumstances? Who does she think she is? He draws himself up to his full height, puffs out his chest, and pauses in front of her, sword raised and pointed at her breast. "Interesting time to be smug, elf," he says. "You do know why I'm here, don't you?" "To kill a defenseless pregnant woman, yes," says the elf, easing the tip of his sword away from her with the dagger in her hands. She gets up, wincing a little, her free hand bracing her belly. "The funny thing is that I'm not defenseless," she tells him. "You made sure of that, didn't you? This is yours after all." She flips the dagger and holds it defensively across her belly, her shoulders hunched and ready to fight. "You want to kill me? Give it your best shot." Balin scowls at her and swings his sword. She dodges it easily, swiping at him with her dagger and careful not to let him get too close. She parries his blows one-handed, the other braced under her bump as she dodges under his arm and catches his sword against her own. She pushes back with a grunt, and Balin stumbles a little, impressed. "You move quickly for a pregnant elf who almost lost her child," he snarls. "It's stubborn," she snaps. "Reminds me a little bit of me." Balin snorts and rounds on his men. "Well," he says. "Charge." The elf blanches, but his men advance anyway, not at all hesitant about attacking someone in her condition, especially now that she's shown she's hardly defenseless. She turns on her heel and runs, Balin almost laughs, into the confines of the Bantha Lodge, like it's safer for her in there where there's less room to move. "Stupid girl," he snorts, following his men in after her. "You had a better chance of surviving this out." He cuts himself off, frowning as he crosses into the threshold. The lodge is quiet, and there's no sign of her in the entrance hall. His men look just as confused as he feels, but he shakes his head. She's a moon shadow elf, after all, sneaking around is her forte. "Fan out," he commands. "Find her and bring her to me." His men nod, filling the entrance hall and barging into rooms to search them, but it's not until Balin's alone again that he spots her hiding behind the wall at the top of the stairs. He snorts at her. "Running away like a coward," he goads. "I thought more of you." "Millimeter," yeah, taunts the elf. Nothing says brave like having 20 men attack a pregnant elf on her own. He hears her take a breath before she steps out to face him. She's still got the dagger in her hands, but there's another weapon at her side now too, a sunforge blade, its dim glow lighting up the sneer on her features. She beckons him closer with a finger, the corner of her lip tilting upwards in a smirk. "Why don't you face me on your own like a man?" He laughs at her, stepping carefully up the stairs, his sword gripped tightly in his hand. "Because I'm not an idiot," he says. "In any case, I'm not here to fight fair. I'm just here to kill you." He steps onto the landing and jabs at her, but she only dodges and rolls out of the way. "Suppose you do kill me tonight," she says. "Then what?" "Then every elf in the city will revolt against it, against humans, and your king and your prince will have no choice but to shut the borders for good." Balin smirks at her. "You didn't think I just hated you, did you? Don't flatter yourself. You and your husband disgraced me, but your kind are monsters and have no place here. This marriage of yours only solidifies the alliance Catullus has with Zadia, but your death, and at the hands of humans, no less, that destroys everything you worked for, doesn't it? That removes you monsters from this side of the border. And, you know, as a bonus, you'll be dead." He lunges at her, but this time she brings the sunforge blade to meet him. His sword catches hers, just for a moment, before the heat of her blade sears through his and the pointy end of his sword drops to the ground, useless. "I'm impressed," laughs the elf, darting backwards. She turns the sunforge blade around in her hand. "But those assassins of yours couldn't kill me. You won't either. If I wanted you dead then, I'd have hired assassins who were competent," snaps Balin. He swipes at her again with what's left of his sword, but she spins out of the way and he puts the metal of his broken blade into the wall instead. "They were never meant to succeed that night. They were just meant to scare your husband into hiding you away." The elf scowls at him, her guard dropping just for a moment. "You paid 8 men and women to try to kill me, knowing they would die trying before you ever had to give away a cent. And you're calling me the monster?" "They were just assassins," says Balin with a shrug. "Not even very good ones, as I'm sure you know. No one will miss them." The elf makes a face, disgusted, but Balin yanks his sword out of the wall and leers towards her, spinning the hilt in his hands. Fine then, she snaps, backing away from him. You separated us. I'm here, and he's all the way over there, and I've had this, she waves the dagger in his face, the whole time, so you knew I was here. Why wait? Why not try this earlier? Balin smirks at her. You figured out its purpose but not why I waited. I thought you were smarter. Indulge me anyway. Balin takes his own turn to laugh. Your darling husband, he drawls. You think I would have risked coming here if there was any chance he could get here while I was? No. He's at the confluence of kings today, isn't he? He couldn't get here in time to rescue you even if he flew. The elf snorts at him, her smile mocking and unfriendly. Bold of you to think I need rescuing, she sneers. But honestly, I'm still impressed. I didn't think you had the brains to pull off something like this. Suppose all that time in disgrace gave you some time to think. Balin skulls. Enough of this, he says, tossing his half-sword to the ground and unsheathing a dagger from his own belt. I'm here for one thing, and it's you. Now do the kingdom of Catullus a favor and die. He charges at her, but the elf smirks and ducks out of the way. Not today. She's a graceful fighter, even pregnant, he'll give her that. She parries his blows left-handed and attacks with the Sunforge blade in her right, but he's faster and stronger than her in every way. He dodges her swipes with ease. Once, she clips his old armor with the Sunforge blade, but she doesn't get close beyond that. He pushes back, relentless, until she shoulders her way into the room at the end of the hall and makes a break for the window. He actually laughs. There's a two-story drop on the other side of the glass with no ledges to climb onto and nothing else to slow her fall, and there's no way she can get to the door without passing by him first. She's trapped up here, and Balin unhooks a crossbow from his hip, loads it at his leisure, and takes aim at her from the doorway. Nowhere else to run, elf, he sneers, even as she makes a break for the wall and slides open the laundry chute door. You're going to die today. Am I? She asks, holding the Sunforge blade over the chute. She flickers. Balin pauses, his finger on the trigger of the crossbow, a frown creasing his brow. Downstairs, he hears his men, their voices frantic as they try to call for him, and the elf smirks as realization dawns on his features. This was a trap. He fires the crossbow. The elf disappears. The Sunforge blade drops, and then there's fire in the lodge, rushing up the chute and spilling out through the door. Balin scrambles out of the room, his cape over his nose as smoke fills the air, and downstairs, he hears his men scream. He stumbles across the hall to the banister to find the exits blocked by flames and his men on their knees, sputtering and struggling to breathe, their faces panicked as they look for some way to escape. He snarls and pulls his map from his belt, but the blip is gone. Of course it would be. She knew what the dagger was, and if she's with that midge girl, then it's too much to hope she wouldn't have disabled it or cloaked it in some way. Meanwhile his men are dying, and he's lost his upper hand, and she's gone. There's no way to track her, and her prince will know he's behind all this by dawn. Well done, elf, he hisses, reaching into the pouch at his belt for the phoenix beak within it. Sem Alfmroth Emdlis. The beak crumbles in his palm, what's left of its power running through his veins, cooling his skin and his armor enough to walk through the fire at the front entrance unharmed and undeterred. The night air fills his lungs happily, and he stares into the darkness angry, but alive. His men aren't quite so lucky, but there's a lesson in their loss. Picked up some new tricks, I see, he mutters, scowling. Not to worry, elf. So have I. X. Miles away, Rayla opens her eyes and gasps awake. They're in a clearing about 4 hours from the Bantha Lodge on horseback. Soren's standing guard, the bottle of potent serum in hand and at the ready, Rowena on her left, Claudia on her right, her primal stone lighting up the concentration on her features. Princess fusses Rowena. She scrambles for a skin of water hanging off one of the horse's saddles and unstops it for her. Princess, breathe, you're okay. Beside her, Claudia drops the primal stone, her shoulders slumping in exhaustion, but she takes Rayla's elbows in her hands anyway and helps her sit up. Rayla, what happened? Mira, Rayla rasps, gulping down as much water as her mouth will allow her. Quick. Rowena fumbles, her fingers clumsy as she tries to pull the message mirror out of the pocket of Rayla's dress. She presses it into Rayla's palms, and Rayla wipes the excess water off her chin with her sleeve and clears Callum's last message with the heel of her hand. "It's Balin," she writes. "He found us, but we're okay. We're safe. The little moonbeam too." There's a long pause before the mirror lights up again. Rayla takes it as an opportunity to get to her feet and to let Claudia and Rowena help her back onto a horse. When Callum responds, his answer is brief. "Thank the gods. Go to the moon nexus. I'll meet you there." She holds the message up to the others. "You heard him," she says hoarsely. "Let's move." Chapter 18. Summary. "We wanted to have a baby shower for you, you know," she tells Rayla quietly. She sounds almost sad about it. "We were so excited." Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 18. Rayla messages him just after nightfall. "It's been a long day. Kuritsa is exhausted. Callum's been riding her ragged, urging her into her fastest gallop with little to no breaks, but as desperate as he is to get to Rayla now, as much as he wants to find and protect his wife and unborn child, an injured horse won't get him to her faster. He stops to let Kuritsa rest for the night on the bank of a river on the outskirts of the city. She's not pleased with him, and in total honesty, Callum's not pleased with himself either. He should never have agreed to hide Rayla away. He should never have been more than half a day's ride from her. And if anything's happened to her, if the reason she hasn't messaged him back all day is because something's gone wrong, he'd never forgive himself for it. He gives Kuritsa a carrot, takes the saddlebag off her back and lets her wander a little way down the river, but he leaves his things packed. There's no point in setting up camp, not really, not when he knows he won't be sleeping tonight. There's little chance he'll be sleeping at all until he knows for sure that Rayla's safe and back in his arms. He tries and he tries and he tries to convince himself that it's a long shot, that she's been safe for months, and that there's no reason to believe that would change now. Even if someone did find her, Soren and Claudia are there, and they'd promised to protect her, and, pregnant or not, she can take care of herself, but the image of blood between her thighs is burned into his memory, her fear, her panic, his own terror etched into his mind like those assassins had come for her yesterday and not 2 entire months ago. What if they've found her again? What if it's too late? What if they're babies? He's too scared to even finish the question. He spends the evening pacing in the clearing, clinging to Claudia's message mirror like his life depends on Rayla's next message, staring at his own writing and praying to every god he knows of for her and the baby to be okay. When her message does come, he nearly breaks. "It's Balin," her handwriting says, the lines shaky and hurried. "He found us, but we're okay. We're safe. The little moonbeam too." The air leaves his lungs in a rush. His knees wobble. His throat closes and his heart hammers in his chest, his relief so overwhelming that he doesn't know what to do with himself. He collapses against a tree, his face buried in his palms, his breathing heavy and uneven as he reads the message a second, third, fourth time before he dares to believe it. "Thank heavens," he whispers at last. It's almost a sob, but Callum doesn't even care. They're fine. They're safe. They're okay. That's all that matters. He sucks in a breath, holds it within his lungs and lets it settle the racing of his heart before he wipes the mirror clean at last. "Thank the gods," he writes finally. "Go to the moon nexus. I'll meet you there." It's a split-second decision. The nexus is difficult to get to, and Luyan's illusions might scare off anyone who doesn't already know that that's all they are, but it's risky and he knows it. It'll take a few days to get there, even on horseback, more, Callum tells himself, because at 30 weeks, Rayla shouldn't be riding on horseback at all, and even beyond that, there are bandits and banthas and all manner of other things that would be a danger to her and the baby, but what other choice do they have? They can't go back to the Bantha Lodge, and it would be unwise to hide in any old village when they can barely even trust their own guards. At the very least, they know Luyan, and her protection and the mountains is certainly a better option than any of the alternatives. Callum swallows heavily and runs a tired hand through his hair. When he checks the mirror again, his handwriting is gone and replaced by Rayla's once more. "Okay. See you soon. I love you." The words make his heart ache. He thinks the separation might have been better if it hadn't come on the heels of an attempted assassination, but 2 months away from her is too long. He misses her so much. And Callum breathes in deeply, wipes the mirror clean with the edge of his hand, and writes back. I love you, too. Please be safe. You and our little moonbeam. We will, comes her response. You too. He stares at her writing for a while after that, unsure how to promise her that he will be when he knows the trip to the Nexus will be fraught with tension and sleepless nights. His own reflection stares up at him behind her writing, his eyes dull and tired, the bags beneath them visible even in the poor light, but something else hits him in that moment too. Balin. Callum frowns at himself in the mirror. Balin, the incompetent, self-serving, ex-head of the Catolan army. The same ex-general as had dismissed after the whole arranged marriage debacle over a year when he'd tried to force Rayla into leaving. The one Callum had punched in the face at a ball for calling Rayla a slew of words he refuses to repeat even in his head. That Balin. His fingers tighten around the mirror. Of course it would be him. How could it be anyone else? He'd had it coming, but they'd still humiliated him. Callum had punched him in the face in front of an audience of human and elven dignitaries, and they stood there and watched as Ezran dismissed him from his council and stripped him of his livelihood. Of course he'd be furious. Of course he'd want Rayla dead. He'd always been old-fashioned and bigoted, and the very concept of elves in Catolis had irked him, even then. Sowing civil unrest in the capital between elves and humans and timing it with the assassination of their brand new elven princess would guarantee a civil war, and would force Ez to close their borders for good. Everything Callum and Rayla had ever worked for would be for nothing, and on top of that, she would be dead and he would be ruined, and at the end of it all, Balin would win and his revenge would be complete. It's almost too smart for him, Callum thinks. Perhaps those months in disgrace had given him time to think. Perhaps they had tempered him and allowed him to plan this to the letter. Whatever the case, he's stepped up his game and Callum finds himself scowling, angered by his gall. How dare he? How dare he even think about touching her? Rayla's blades at his back have never felt so present before now, and they are heavy and ominous within their sheaths. Callum's never been prone to violence, it's, at the very least, never been his first port of call. But there's not a lot he wouldn't do for the sake of his wife and his unborn child right now, and if that means killing this bastard before he has the chance to kill them, then fine, he decides. If that's what he has to do to keep them safe, fine. Something snuffles at his hair, and Callum blinks to find Kuritsa at his side again, looking sated and significantly less irritable. She noses at his ears affectionately, and he lets out a snort, lifts the hand without the mirror in it to pat her snout, and presses his forehead against hers. I'm sorry about today, he mumbles. I was scared that they'd found her. He cuts himself off, a lump in his throat once again. Kuritsa brays at him, her breath blowing gently over the fabric of his scarf. It's not much, but it's understanding, Callum thinks, and he's grateful for it. Rest up, he mutters. We have to start moving again in the morning. Okay. She nickers, folds her legs underneath her, and huffs, curling her body in front of his until he's shielded on both sides by her and the trunk of the tree behind him. Callum lets out a chuckle, her intentions obvious even to him. Thank you, he murmurs, leaning over to brush her mane. Kuritsa only brays once more before she lays her head down to sleep. It's nearing midnight when Rayla lets out a cry. They are still moving, Soren riding on the horse ahead of her, reins wrapped tightly around his knuckles, Rowena on the ground beside her, guiding Vorobei after Soren by her reins, Claudia behind her, masking their tracks with the primal stone in her hand. Rayla's riding side saddle when it happens, better for the baby than riding astride, but not the comfiest way to ride, and certainly not the most stable either. The sudden spasm through her belly rocks her, and she wobbles dangerously on Vorobei before she feels Rowena's hands on hers and Soren's arm under her knees. It's fine, she manages through gritted teeth, even as they help her off Vorobei and as her knees buckle under her when her feet touch the ground. It's okay, it's just, ow, Rayla sucks in a breath, her fingers pressing dents into the skin of her belly as the pain subsides. A contraction finishes Rowena, helping her settle against the nearest tree. She touches Bump carefully, frowning at the tension in the muscles between her fingers. They're normal at this stage, she murmurs, but we need to stop for the night. Halfling bubs have a tendency to come early, but I think riding might be agitating things. We can't stop, says Rayla. We need to put as much distance between us and Balan as possible, and if that means we keep moving. If we keep moving, we put the baby at risk, snaps Rowena, her tone sharp, sharper than Rayla's ever heard it. She catches herself too late and relents almost immediately, her head bowed low, her cheeks red with shame. I'm sorry, princess, But Rayla lets out a sigh and looks away. Don't apologize, she mumbles, because it's true, every moment she's not at rest is dangerous for her and for the baby, and the fact that they, somehow, have to make it to the Moon Nexus while she's so heavily with child is bad enough on its own. Claudia catches Soren's eye over her head, her concern lit up by the dim light of her primal stone. I'll take first watch, she says decisively. We should start moving again before dawn. Rayla gives Rowena a look, an unspoken is that satisfactory in the violet of her eyes. Rowena purses her lips, glancing between the three of them reluctantly, but they're right. There's probably more immediate danger in staying in one place for too long than there is in trying to get to the Nexus, and in the end, she sighs and nods her head. Not a moment sooner she grumbles, getting up briefly to unhook the saddlebag off of Vorobei's back. She comes back with a bunch of blankets bundled under her arms, hands one to Soren and drapes a second over Rayla's knees before she settles against the tree herself. It's an uncomfortable night for all of them. Rowena passes out in minutes, but she tosses and turns in her sleep, shivering under the too thin blanket in the face of the autumn chill. Soren keeps nodding off, but he jerks awake every so often, muttering incoherences under his breath while Claudia paces up and down the clearing. Rayla doesn't even try. The baby's been growing more and more active these past couple of weeks, and between the way it's kicking and the way her stomach turns, she has a feeling that sleep probably won't come anyway. She plays with her mirror instead. There's a new drawing in it, one of her and Callum, his lips pressed to her belly. He doesn't draw himself, usually. He must really miss her if he's kissing her bump through his sketches in lieu of waiting to do so in person. It makes her smile, and when Claudia passes her by probably for the 10th or 11th time, she pauses. You okay? Says Rayla, glancing up at her. Oh. It's just Callum. She holds the mirror out to Claudia, and Claudia takes it, her lips twitching upwards at the little drawing in the glass. She glances around the clearing, listening for extraneous sounds and footsteps coming their way, but when she hears nothing, she drops in front of her, legs crossed, primal stone in her lap. He's really excited to meet the baby, huh, she murmurs, handing the mirror back with cold fingers. Rayla chuckles ruefully. I wish he could be. Right now, he's probably terrified. If it were the other way around, if someone wanted him dead, I'd be losing my mind with worry. I think this all he can do right now. She rearranges her blanket a little, takes the end of it and throws it over Claudia's legs too. I'm sorry you had to do all this. Claudia raises an eyebrow at her. Do all what? Come all the way out here with you to keep you safe from Balan. Well, yeah, mumbles Rayla, glancing away. You could be helping Soren recover. You could be in Lantha learning magic from the elves there. You could not be out here, keeping guard in a clearing in the middle of the night just to. She pauses, still reluctant to admit it, even to herself, to protect me. Claudia makes a face at her, a half frown, closer to incredulous than anything else. Even if we were, you think we wouldn't come back at the first sign of trouble? You'd do the same if we needed you. You did do the same, pregnant and all. I'm just sorry you had to begin with. She draws her knees up under her chin and sighs, her shoulders slumping even as her eyes dart around their clearing once more. We wanted to have a baby shower for you, you know, she tells Rayla quietly. She sounds almost sad about it. We were so excited. Rayla blinks at her, unfamiliar with the term. Baby shower. It's like a little party in honor of a new mom-to-be, Claudia explains. We get you presents, shower you with love, that kind of thing. Ez and I have been planning it since before you guys left for Alon. We'd be having it now, if it wasn't for all this. In spite of herself, Rayla lets out a laugh. She stifles it with her hands, careful not to wake Soren and Rowena. I don't think we need any more gifts, she says quietly. The little moonbeam's got enough to keep it occupied now, I think. But, it'd be nicer than this. Anything would be nicer than this, chuckles Claudia. She breathes in, huddling under the blanket with another sigh. I'm really happy for you guys, she says at last. You deserve to be happy and to start a family, and we'll get him, Rayla. We will, and you're gonna have this baby, and no one's ever going to threaten you, or it, or Callum, ever again. Rayla smiles at her. A real one, a grateful one, and she reaches for Claudia's fingers over the blanket and holds them tight within hers. I don't doubt it, she says quietly. She winces a little as the baby shifts in her womb, its limbs, she thinks, poking her in funny places, and when she catches Claudia's eye, she snorts and rests her hand against the bump. Her fingers are cold, Rayla can feel it through the material of her dress, but they are gentle, and Claudia smiles as it shifts nonetheless. I know we haven't been friends for that long, mutters Rayla at last. But if anything goes wrong the day our little moonbeam comes into the world, or if anything happens to me or to Callum afterwards, promise me you'll look after it. I'm not promising you anything of the sort, says Claudia stubbornly. You're going to be fine. All three of you. Claudia. Claudia swallows, and when she looks at Rayla at last, there's fear in her eyes. Rayla gets it, as much as maternal death has decreased over the past 4 years, thanks mostly to the elves that have settled in Katolis, childbirth isn't without its risks. Rayla likes to think she's come to terms with it, but her death isn't the scariest part. Not really. She'd been an assassin, once upon a time, and she'd grown used to the idea of it, and she hasn't even met the child, and already, she'd rather die than let anything happen to it. No, the scariest part, she thinks, is the idea of her child growing up without someone to look after it. Ezran's young yet, and while he would in a heartbeat, it's unfair for her and Callum to expect him to take it in when he's already supposed to be taking care of his kingdom at so young an age. They can't ask Aunt Amaya, either, because she has responsibilities to Ezran and to Katolis army, and while Rayla loves her uncles dearly, Callum is Ez's heir apparent, which means this child would have a claim to the Katolan throne and would have to be raised in Katolis until such a time that Ez produces as an heir himself. It has to be you, says Rayla finally. If anything happens to us, you and Soren are the only ones we can reasonably ask to raise this child. Promise me you'll look after it. Rayla, I can't. Promise me. Claudia swallows, but there's a seriousness in the way Rayla grips her hand that doesn't let her look away. I promise, she mumbles at last. But nothing's going to happen to either of you. You're going to raise your little moonbeam yourself. We'll make sure of it. I know you will, says Rayla, but relief wells in her chest anyway. But just in case. Claudia hesitates, but she grips Rayla's hand back, her jaw clenched shut when she nods. Just in case. X. In Kira, Ranan receives a raven. It arrives in the late morning, and the message it carries bears the seal of the King of Katolis. The letter itself is short, just a few sentences in King Ezran's hurried scrawl, and when Ranan reads over it, he feels his stomach drop through the floor. Someone tried to have Rayla assassinated. They're on the move now to get her someplace safe. They need help. I'll send more information as I get it. Tinker, he snaps, the letter scrunched in his good hand. Where's my bow? I need to get to Katolis. Notes. Hey, so technically I'm still on a break, but also I have job interview I need to study for, and if you were reading Ada when it came out, you'll know what happens when I get stressed. It's fic. I turn to fic when I get stressed. Chapter 19. Summary. You're despicable, seethes Callum. And I will end you if I have to. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 19. I don't suppose there's any stopping you. Tinker's words come out terse. Bitter, almost, and from a certain standpoint, Ranan understands. It's not like he's forgotten that his left arm is just an illusion. It might feel real, and it might have enough dexterity to help him do the simpler, day-to-day things, but he's not an assassin by trade anymore for a reason, and it's not because of the fragile peace between Zadia and the Five Kingdoms. He hasn't been in a fight since his now nephew-in-law pulled him out of that coin in the worst shape of his life, his body weak and malnourished, his arm blackened and dead at his side. No, he hasn't forgotten. He could never forget the agony of that binding and the way his confinement in that coin had forced him to bear it alone. He could never forget the months of painful rehabilitation, and the months after that of learning how to use the prosthetic to the limited dexterity he has today. He might pretend that he's fine now, but he'll never, ever forget. But Rayla might as well be a daughter to him, and he can't stand by and do nothing while she's in danger. If the circumstances were different, he might find it funny, assassins coming for her like she isn't better trained and more capable than any other in the world, but she'll be close to 31 weeks pregnant now, and he imagines defending herself isn't exactly an option. "Do you really expect me not to go?" he asks at last, drawing his knapsack shut with a scowl. He snatches his bow off the bed. "That's all it can be now. The swords it breaks into are supposed to be dual-wielded, and one without the other is not quite as useful as just using the bow form." Tinker shakes his head. "No," he mutters quietly. "Of course not. Not if Rayla needs help." He steps aside to let Ronan back into the hall, his boots tucked neatly under his good arm, a quiver of arrows hanging haphazardly from his elbow. Tinker takes it from him, disapproval set into the downturned line of his lips. "Let me come with you." "No," the answer is clipped. Short, and perhaps a bit more brusque than Ronan intends for it to be, but he has other concerns right now. "It's dangerous." Tinker bristles. "And it'll be less dangerous for you, will it?" he says dryly. "Don't be a fool, Ronan, you can't help her in your condition. Not on your own." "I can and I will," snaps Ronan. "I made a promise to her mother. I won't break it. She's my niece as much as she is yours." Ronan scowls a second time, dumps his knapsack and his boots into a pile on the floor, and rounds on Tinker, unimpressed. "What, exactly, do you intend to do?" he hisses, drawing himself to his full height. "You're not combat trained. You have no experience in battle. You won't be any use to her or to me if things go south. You won't be of any use to her dead." Tinker glares at him, his shoulders square, his eyes hard. He snatches at the charm Ronan wears on his belt, and the prosthetic arm shimmers and disappears, an unpleasant demonstration of the fact that Ronan's not what he used to be, no matter how much he tries to pretend that he is. "You're being stubborn," snaps Tinker. "That's how even the best of warriors die. She won't forgive you for that. Neither will I. You will not put me through that again." Ronan has the decency to look abashed at that. He turns his eyes away, guilty, and snatches the charm back, his arm shimmering back into place. "I can't not go, Tinker. I'm not asking you not to." Tinker's voice is earnest, and he takes the charm again to tie it back onto Ronan's belt. "I want you to let me help." "You can't." He still doesn't look at him, ashamed of the truth he's so hesitant to admit. "I can't protect us both. Not like this." "You don't have to protect me," says Tinker gently. He tilts Ronan's face back towards his, the pads of his fingers soft against his cheek. "I can take care of myself. I just want you to be safe. I can't lose you. Or her. Not again." His voice drops to a whisper, but he holds Ronan's gaze, unafraid of the intimacy. Ronan heaves a sigh. Tinker's always been better at honest words, but to Ronan, it's easier to be so in gestures. It's a Moonshadow elf thing, he thinks. Probably something to do with the fact that he doesn't have to admit to being afraid in so many words. He touches Tinker's hand, brings it to his lips and presses a kiss against his fingertips, understanding and patience in the deliberateness of his movements. "You won't," he says at last, his voice soft. "Lose either of us, I mean. I'll find her, and I'll keep her safe, I swear it. But, if you want to help, then I need you here. King Azran needs a point of contact, and I need those messages relayed to me somehow, or it'll be a tougher job. I'll bring her home, Tinker. Her, and the baby, and her prince. It'll be okay." Tinker's eyes harden, unhappy with the decision, but there's a softness on his face that understands. "Give me your charm then," he says, only a little crisply. His irritation isn't lost on Ronan, but he doesn't argue all the same. "If you're going to go, then you'll go with better protection than that." Ronan releases a breath, almost relieved. "Thank you," he murmurs, removing the charm from his belt once more, but Tinker shakes his head. "Save it for when you get back," he says, turning away from him. "It's rude to die ungrateful." "I won't die." So they all say, snorts Tinker. But at least this way, there's impetus not to. X. The Bantha Lodge is still smouldering when Callum gets to it the following morning. He feels his jaw tighten at the sight of it. Its charred, black remains like an unpleasant scar in the woods. He pulls Kuritsa to a stop by the river and climbs off of her, one of Rayla's blades in his hand, raised and at the ready, for Balin, in case he's still here, for anyone. But the ruined lodge is empty, and there's no one else in the woods. There's only the rush of the river and the crunch of autumn leaves under his feet, and Kuritsa, braying uneasily as he leaves her on the riverbank. It'll just be a few minutes, he promises her. We'll be out of here before you know it. She stamps her feet uncomfortably but does nothing else. Callum doesn't really blame her. The quiet sets him on edge. It's too still, too silent for what happened here last night. The wreckage is too fresh, the tracks are too sinister, the smell of smoke and burned flesh still hangs in the air, too pungent to ignore. It makes him shudder. Rayla had told him everything through the mirror, how they'd found the tracking rune within the sheath of the dagger, how Claudia had linked it to the blade to fool Balin into thinking they were still there, how they'd doused the lodge in turpentine to remove as much of the threat as possible in one fell swoop. Quietly, Callum wonders if he should feel more remorse for the men that died here. There's been a lot of that lately, he's noticed, but between them and the safety of his wife and child, he knows which he'd rather. He imagines some of these ashes are theirs. He steps into the threshold gingerly, his footprints leaving clean spots in the blackened stones. The floorboards creak under his feet and Callum hesitates, afraid for a moment that what's left of the wood won't hold his weight, but the moment passes, and he presses on. Ayla's sunforge blade is still in the basement, Rayla had told him. He'd offered to grab it on his way past if only because a blade like that might be dangerous if anyone else, Reed, Balin, found it in the wreckage, but there are other weapons here too, swords and spearheads and snapped bows, the silver of their steel tarnished by the fire. There's a part of him that thinks he should be comforted by this. It's proof that Rayla can take care of herself, even now, proof that she's still as strong, and as clever, and as unyielding as she's always been in spite of the dire circumstances, and that it'll take more than the 20 men who were here last night to knock her down, but the ruined lodge and the broken weapons serve as reminders instead, of the people who wanted her dead and of what it took to get away. Callum's grip around the hilt of her blade tightens. He swallows, wrinkling his nose at the still overly present smell of smoke and ash, but he sucks in a breath, shaking off his aversion to it as he picks his way through the rest of the damage. He finds the sunforge blade exactly where she'd said it would be, blade embedded in the stones at the bottom of what's left of the laundry chute, the sheath tucked safely away behind a loose brick in the wall. Callum tugs it out of the ground with a grunt, sheaths it without ceremony, and hurries back up the stairs, eager to be back on his way. He whistles for Kuritsa as he climbs onto the landing, and she nickers, trots towards the front steps, her mane fluttering gently in the breeze. The blade goes straight into her saddlebag, its hilt sticking awkwardly out of the opening, and Callum's in the process of flicking Rayla's blade back into its own hilt when he hears a twig snap in the distance. Kuritsa's ears prick forward. Callum's heart leaps into his throat. He panics. Flicks the blade back out again and seizes the mare by the reins to tug her behind the single, still standing stone wall with runes scribbled hastily into the air behind them to mask their tracks. No one appears for a while. And then, Balin. Callum's breath catches in his throat, and he shushes Kuritsa and draws a different rune into the air. Non nostrum videas, he whispers, Kuritsa's reins tight around his fist. Sure, he adds to her. Sure, hold still, okay. Just for a bit. Kuritsa shakes out her mane uneasily, but she makes no other sounds, even as Balin strides through the clearing with a grim determination set into the lines of his face. The past year and a bit hasn't been kind to him. He certainly looks older than that day Aes had dismissed him from the castle, his armor ill-fitting and loose on his frame. His eyes are colder, though. Crueler, and more calculating, his lips pressed together severely as he climbs the stone steps at the front of the lodge, ignorant to their presence thanks to Callum's magic. He pauses at the top of the steps, the pack in his right fist swinging lightly in the autumn wind, and he frowns. For a moment, Callum thinks he might see them, moon magic and all, but he shakes his head a moment later and steps into the lodge. Callum's knuckles go white around the hilt of Rayla's blade, his breathing growing heavier as anger rises in his chest. He could do it now. End this once and for all while Balan's not ready for him. Strike him down while his back is turned, the way he would if the situation were reversed. It'd be easy. Too easy. So easy that Callum doesn't realize he's started forward until Balan pulls a book from his bag and sets a candle on the burnt floorboards. Callum stares at him from behind the invisibility of his magic. A vigil perhaps? No. He's not the type. But then he pulls a little clay pot from his pack too. Removes the lid from it and sprinkles its contents into the flame. Whispers something unintelligible and blows. Callum recognizes the ritual almost too late. The wolves materialize with a howl, wisps of smoke rolling off their bodies, their eyes glowing purple and menacing against blackness of their fur. It's been years since Callum's seen them, only, there's something different about them. Claudia's were made of smoke when she summoned them, all those years ago. Balan's are, solid. His intentions are obvious the moment they appear, but Curitsa nickers before Callum has the chance to do anything about it. She rears, afraid of them and the magic that's brought them into being, and the invisibility spell breaks with her movements. When Balan looks up, he smirks, his surprise betrayed only briefly when it crosses his face. "Your Highness," he drawls, bowing insincerely. "I wish I could say I was surprised, but of course your whore of a wife would go running straight to you. Have you come to kill me, then?" Callum snarls at him, untangling his hand from Curitsa's reins to draw Rayla's other blade from its sheath at his back. "If that's what it's going to take," he snaps. He jabs one of Rayla's swords at his wolves. "Learned some new tricks, I see. Pretty sure those are illegal." Balan snorts. "Do you like them? It took a while to get them just right. Can't have them blowing away after all. No, these are much more dangerous. I'm very pleased with how they've come out." "You're despicable," seethes Callum. "And I will end you if I have to." Balan's smirk grows wider. "How very chivalrous of you," he says, drawing his own sword. "You're welcome to try, I suppose. Do you think you could do it before my wolves find your wife?" He snaps his fingers, and the wolves howl once more and make a break for the wood. They disappear into the trees in wisps of purple smoke, and panic flares in Callum's system. His eyes flit after them. Claudia's moon magic isn't made for combat like that, and if those wolves find them, they'll be sitting ducks, but Balan's there and all of this could end now. Balan only laughs. "What'll it be, Your Highness?" he taunts. "My life or hers?" Callum doesn't dignify him with a response. He flicks both of Rayla's blades back into their hilts and vaults onto Curitsa's back, scribbling a rune into the air as he steers Curitsa after them. Lightning sparks in his hands. "Fulminis Maxima," he roars, hurling it at Balan. But Balan's already gone. Callum scowls to himself, but he wastes no more time looking for him, the fear in his gut far too real to ignore. "Go Curitsa," he hisses, the urgency plain in his voice. "Hurry." He can only hope he finds them before the wolves do. Claudia recognizes the howling before anyone else does. She pauses in her tracks, and it takes Rayla a full 10 seconds before she realizes that Claudia's fallen behind, her brow furrowed at the woods behind them. They've been following the Sanigan River for a couple of hours now. They need somewhere to cross, but the river is wide, and the current is too fast for the horses to tolerate. Soren had said something about a ford a little closer to the base of the mountain, which would probably be ideal, Rayla thinks. If Claudia didn't look so concerned. Rayla tugs Vorobei to a stop, swiveling in his saddle carefully to frown after her. "Claudia," she calls. "What's wrong?" Claudia hesitates, her shoulders tense, her back straight, her primal stone clutched tightly in her hands. Even with her back to her, Rayla can practically see the way she stares down the wood, her eyes following the birds as they flutter from trees, her ears pricked for. Rayla hears it the second time. The howling is unmistakable. She remembers it from years ago. Remembers the burn of the bite in her arm and the way her swords passed uselessly throughout the smoke of their bodies, but there's something different about the sound this time around. Something worse. It makes her blood run cold. "We have to move," whispers Claudia. "Now." Rayla wastes no time arguing with her. She shuffles forward in the saddle to let Claudia climb on behind her, lets her take the reins so she can brace her belly, and whistles to spur Vorobei into a quicker trot. Soren and Rowena are a little way ahead now, and Claudia calls out to them. Soren. We've gotta move faster. There's. She doesn't even get the whole sentence out. A blur leaps from the edge of the wood, its shadowy paws catch Soren right in the chest, bowling him over and into riverbank. He barely has time to get his arms up in front of his face, and Rowena steers the stallion around, but he rears, terrified of the wolves and of the dark magic pulsing from off their fur as two more appear from the wood, teeth bared and menacing. Soren kicks the first off, swearing, his gauntlets singed with bite marks. Get across the river, he barks, fumbling for the bottle of potent serum in his pocket. Rowena. Go. Rowena hesitates, reluctant to leave, but her stallion is panicked, its eyes so wide that Rayla can see the whites of its eyes, even from here. She clicks her tongue, come on, Vorobei, we have to help. Urging her forwards despite the filly's obvious terror, until Claudia slides out of the saddle and slaps Vorobei's rear flank. Get her out of here, Vorobei, she snaps, rune already half drawn in the air in front of her. Go. We'll catch up. Rayla shakes her head, furious, reins wrapped so tightly around her hands that they leave prints in her skin. I'm not leaving you here, she argues. If you're going to stay and fight, then so am I. You can't do anything, snaps Soren. He puts himself between her and the wolves, there's 5 of them now, stalking towards them and forcing them into the river. Vorobei stamps uneasily, splashing water onto Rayla's ankles as she backs into the Sanagan. Rayla scowls at him. And you can. More than you, growls Soren, drawing his baselard in one hand, his potent serum clenched tightly in the other. Get out of here. We'll be fine, Rayla adds Claudia sharply, conjuring illusions of white hounds out of stone in her hand. You have to go. Now. She slaps Vorobei's thigh for good measure, and the filly nickers, splashing further into the river. No, Claudia. Soren. They don't listen. No one does. Vorobei whines as she treads into the Sanagan, the water too cold to be even remotely comfortable, but she doesn't stop, no matter how hard Rayla tugs at her reins. Rowena and her stallion are already halfway into the river, the water chest high on the horse beneath her. Even she tries to steer him back, to help, to do something, but the stallion whinnies, afraid of the wolves and too determined to get to the bank on the other side to pay her any heed. Rayla snarls. We can't leave them, she manages desperately, yanking even harder against Vorobei's reins. The rush of the river is loud in her ears, drowning out the sound of Soren's grunts and Claudia's draconic, and when she glances back, she does so in time to see Soren tackled once more into the ground, the vial of potent serum flying out of his grasp. Please, Vorobei, we have to help. But Vorobei ignores her. The cold bites through the leather of her boots, water soaking into the hem of her maternity dress and creeping upwards until it feels like ice on her thighs. The current is quick here, too quick for Rayla to get off and make her way back to them herself. Moon and stars, she's never been so furious, so helpless. There's a solid chance Claudia and Soren won't make it out of this alive, and there's nothing she can do but watch. Rayla swears. She pounds a fist into the horn of Vorobei's saddle, the reins so tight around her hands and the river so cold that her fingers are going numb. We have to go back, she pleads, knowing Vorobei won't listen. Please, we can't leave them there. Flammasfra. That voice, Rayla would know it anywhere. Hope blooms in her chest, and she turns in the saddle, her voice tearing painfully from her throat. Callum. He's there, his face twisted into an angry skull, one of her blades in his hand as he leaps off Kuritsa and kicks Soren's potent serum back within reach, a ball of flames in his hand to keep Claudia out of harm's way. It's like seeing him for the first time, his magic awe-inspiring, his dexterity with her blades far better than she remembers. His movements aren't quite so graceful, but there's a precision there that she's sure he didn't have when she first put her blades into his hands and taught him how to spar. He turns, his breath heavy, catches sight of Rayla and Rowena, partway through the river, and draws a silver rune into the air, muttering something under his breath before he blows. A strip of water freezes across the Sanagan, a bridge, Rayla realizes, and he ushers Claudia and Soren onto it, their faces bruised, their fingers singed. Get them out of here, Rayla thinks she hears him say. Get them somewhere safe. As you wish, your highness, manages Soren tiredly. He hurries across the ice with a limp, Claudia trailing carefully behind him while Callum fends off the last of Balan's wolves. He ducks under the bite of one, sends it hurtling into another with a clever combination of steel and magic, binds them both to the riverbank with an ice spell and holds them there until cracks appear in their shadowy fur and until they crumble beneath his magic, before he follows after Claudia and Soren, Kuritsa splashing into the river at his side. They get to her first, but Rayla shakes her head. "Go get Roe," she tells them. "I'll be okay." Claudia nods mutely, her footsteps clunking against the ice as she and Soren hurry across Callum's makeshift bridge. Rayla steers Vorobay towards it, heaves herself onto the ice and untangles her fingers from the reins, her hands marked with the shape of the leather. Vorobay lets out a huff, relieved to have some slack, and without Rayla tugging so hard, she moves quicker across Sanigan and with significantly less trouble. Rayla watches her climb onto the bank after the stallion, her teeth chattering from the cold. The bottom half of her dress is soaked through, and the ice and the bitter wind aren't helping. She curls into herself, breathes into her hands and rubs them against her belly to keep warm, and when Callum reaches her at last, he falls to his knees. "Oh my gods, Rayla," he mutters, pulling her into his arms. He kisses her hair, her forehead, the space between her horns, holds her hands within his and breathes onto them himself and... Gods, Rayla missed him. There was never any doubt that she did, but his voice, and his eyes, and even his very scent, she doesn't even know where to begin except to cling to him with freezing fingers. A sob breaks from her lips, the adrenaline and the hormones and the emotional turmoil too much for her all at once, especially when he shrugs off his scarf and his jacket and drapes them over her shoulders until she's bundled up by his warmth. "Callum," she manages. "Callum, He shushes her with a kiss. "It's okay," he murmurs. I'm here, now. You're okay." He presses another kiss into her hair as another howl sounds from the woods. They both pause, his arms tightening around her shoulders, her breath hitching in her throat. Quietly, Callum draws a rune and breaks the ice off from the other side of the river, muttering spells under his breath until that half of the bridge is gone, until the ice shrinks and the current carries it away. "Let's get you somewhere safe, okay," he murmurs at last. Rayla nods against him. He doesn't let go of her once. Notes. "This took so long, I'm so sorry." Chapter 20. Summary. I love you, Rayla. And I missed you, and our little moonbeam, and, he clears his throat. I'm just glad to be home. Chapter text. XX. Most days, Rayla makes a point of reminding everyone in the immediate vicinity that she can take care of herself, but there's something to be said about the way Callum refuses to leave her side that even she doesn't dispute. It's understandable, he'd missed her, and she him, and, to be perfectly frank, she's not all that eager to be without him again in the first place. 2 months is too long, and the mirrors had helped, but it's not the same. His warmth, his touch, his very presence is different entirely, and the way he tugs Kuritsa along, his hand uncomfortably high just so his knuckles brush her shins every now and then, isn't lost on her. They leave the Sanigan cold and battered and exhausted. Soren has bite-shaped singes in his armor, Claudia has a bruise blooming on her left temple, and Rayla and Rowena are both soaked and shivering, even under the weight of multiple cloaks and blankets, but they are alive and that's what matters. There are more of those shadow wolves out there, their howls menacing and eerie in the cold autumn air, but they don't follow them across the river. Maybe it's because Callum's here now, or maybe they can't cross over water, or maybe they can't be too far away from the source that conjured them. Either way, they travel for the rest of the afternoon unhindered. It should make Rayla feel safer, she thinks, at least a little, but even the distant howling makes her blood run cold and fills the pit of her stomach with dread. They make camp for the night in a cave a little way up the base of the mountain. It's strangely nostalgic, even if the company is a bit different. It's still her and Callum and an unborn baby, avoiding villages and finding safety in the darkness of an empty cave. If the circumstances were different, Rayla might have made jokes about it, but as it is, she doesn't have it in her to even crack a smile. Callum lights a fire. Rowena counts the baby's movements once they are both dry and gives Rayla a once-over to make sure everything's still okay. Claudia and Soren try to wander off to scout the area and find food. Rowena scowls after them. "I don't know that either of you are in a condition to do anything of the sort," she snaps. Secretly, Rayla thinks the severity of her tone is impressive. She doesn't pull rank often, but she is their resident nurse, and they all know that she's right. But Soren shrugs his shoulders and pats Ayla's Sunforge blade, now safely secured to his belt again thanks to Callum. Her Royal Highness has to eat, he says, his tone pointed. She's pretty heavily with child, Rowie, we can't let her starve just because we're in no condition to hunt. Plus, it's pretty naive to just assume that we're safe, adds Claudia quickly, before Rayla even has the chance to be indignant at Soren's choice of words. We need to know what's out there. Rowena only bristles. We made up some good distance and we have rations from the lodge. There's no need to do anything risky. It's risky not to scout the area. Claudia gives her a look. If you're so worried, why don't you come with us? Might be a good time for a walk. Her eyes flit meaningfully to Rayla and Callum, their true intention painfully clear. What, and leave Her Highness alone? She's not alone, says Soren, nodding at Callum. She's got Callum now. She'll be fine. But she still needs to eat, and we still need to scout the area. Rowena hesitates, a grimace pulling at her lips. She's not an idiot, the understanding on her face is there, plain as day, but she has a duty of care to Rayla too, and it's not so professional to just leave after such a harrowing ordeal. She's absolutely right to be reluctant. This pregnancy's been hard, and Rayla's been doing a lot of things she really shouldn't be doing this late in the game, but an hour away won't hurt either. Rayla wonders, sometimes, if she gets tired, being a nurse and midwife 24/7, and even from her own perspective, a little privacy isn't unwanted. It's been 2 very long months, and she and Callum have barely had the chance to even talk. But Callum steps in then. Go, Rowie, he says, insists, at last. I'll look after her. Prince's honor. She can't really argue with that. It might as well be an order. Callum's her prince after all. Rowena presses her lips together, like there's an argument building behind them that she's trying to keep dammed up. It'd be fine, Rayla thinks, if they were still at the lodge, and giving them privacy meant as little as leaving the room, but going out with Claudia and Soren and being too far away to run back if she's needed is different. In the end, she huffs. Of course, Your Highness, she grumbles finally. Can I borrow one of your mirrors, at least? So I can come straight back if anything goes wrong. That's fair, chuckles Callum, pulling his from his pocket and tossing it gently into her hands. You're a good nurse, Rowie, he adds. Thank you. Rowan relents and lets out a sigh, something like a blush gracing the pale skin of her cheeks. Thank me when the baby's born, and once this all blows over, she says quietly. We won't be gone long, Claudia promises, more to Rowena than to Callum and Rayla. Just be safe, says Callum. We'll see you soon. There are no other arguments after that. Claudia, Soren, and Rowena take their leave, Soren waving lazily as he and the others make their way back into the woods, and Callum draws a breath, waiting until they are well and truly out of earshot before he turns to Rayla at last and crushes his lips against hers. Rayla doesn't miss a beat. She kisses him back, just as forcefully, just as desperately, because it's been 2 long months of missing each other, of pining for each other, of spending every waking moment clinging to their mirrors hoping the other's safe, and Callum's here now and she doesn't know how else to tell him how much it sucked to be apart. Her fingers find their way to his cheeks, and his are gentle on her shoulders, but gods, how she'd missed the taste of his lips, and the warmth of his hands, and the fit of her body against his. When he pulls away, his breath shudders, an almost sob breaking from his lips. I'm sorry, he whispers, holding her tight. I'm so sorry. I never should have agreed to send you away. I should have been with you, the whole time, Rayla, I... Hush. Rayla kisses him once more and brushes the hair out of his eyes. Carefully, she pries his hands from his shoulders and sets them against the swell of her belly as the baby wriggles within her. I'm okay, she murmurs. Look, we both are. He shakes his head. No, Rayla, it's my fault, I gave you that dagger, and all this time his breathing hitches, threatening to stop altogether as he stumbles over his apologies. Rayla shushes him. You didn't know, she says, her thumbs on his cheeks. Her voice is firm as she tilts his face up to meet her eyes. Callum. Listen. You didn't know. Neither of us did. And we're safe now because of you. Look at me. She ducks her head, framing his face with her hands so he can't avoid her gaze. She'd missed his eyes too, the green of them, and the honesty and love that usually fills them, but there's guilt there today. For the first time, Rayla realizes how awful he must feel for allowing that dagger to come into their hands in the first place, the terror that must have plagued him knowing that he'd given her the thing that brought Balan to her a second time. She sucks in a breath. Kisses his lips again. Lets him feel for himself that she and the baby are well and truly okay. You didn't know, she says again, her forehead pressed to his. She breathes with him for a moment, steadies his breath with hers until his panic falls away and the rise and fall of his shoulders is even once more. I missed you, she says finally, softly, like a confession even though they've both known it for months. We both did. She's been squirmier since you got here. She. Rayla backtracks. She'd said, like she knows somehow even though there's no real way to be sure. It's a gut feeling more than it is anything else. She's thought it for a while. There's a part of her that's certain of it now. She nods. She's glad you're here. Callum breathes out. It's still shaky, but it's better than it was, and it fully leaves his lungs. He lowers himself to his knees and presses his ear to her belly, savoring the way his baby, his daughter, moves against his cheek. Hey, he whispers. Hey there, baby girl. Daddy's here now. Daddy missed you too. You realize she's kicking you in the face right now? That makes Callum laugh. It's a nice sound. Rayla hadn't realized she'd missed it as much as the rest of him. She smiles down at his head, her fingers fiddling with the hair behind his ears until his breath shudders again and she realizes he's crying. His tears leave spots of wetness in the one dress that isn't soaked and, for a moment, Rayla doesn't know what to do. Surely he's not still feeling guilty about the dagger, but he pulls her closer, his arms coming to rest around her waist and it hits her that it's more than that. He'd missed her. He'd missed his unborn daughter. Most of all, he'd wanted to be with her for every moment of this. Callum's never been one to shy away from his emotions, but his weakness gnaws at her until there's a lump in her throat and an ache in her chest. Rayla draws in a breath, ignorant of the way it shakes as she breathes it in, and smiles down at him, rueful and tired and relieved, all at once. You're here now, she murmurs at last. With us. And we're all okay. I know, mutters Callum. I know. She chuckles at him, a little hoarse with emotion. When the tears do fall, she doesn't stop them. You're here, she says once more, weak and sniffling. Gods, we missed you so much, and I don't even know how to tell you or where to start. He chuckles too. Look at us, he whispers. We're a mess. Just a bit, yeah. Rayla sighs a little as he eases himself off her belly and returns to his feet. We're not doing that again, okay? Never, promises Callum, folding her back into his arms. Never that long. Never again. He presses his lips into her hair, lets her dry her tears against his shoulder and holds her to him until his own tears dry. I love you, Rayla. And I missed you, and our baby girl, and, he clears his throat. I'm just glad to be home. Rayla stifles a laugh into his shoulder. So am I, she whispers. So am I. Soren, Claudia, and Rowena are gone longer than they said they would be. There's a moment when Callum almost panics and considers going after them to make sure they're okay, but between that and leaving Rayla again, this time on her own, there's not really a choice but to sit and wait and trust them to come back. They spend the time talking. Callum tells her how things have been in the city, tense but not escalating, at the very least, and of how the summit had gone for the few hours he was there, and of how Ezran and Aunt Amaya were doing before he left. She frowns at all the irritating parts, laughs at his misery when he complains, and is appropriately curious when he mentions Ez's growing relationship with the Queen of Duran, and in return, she tells him of what he'd missed while he'd been gone. Nothing important, she grumbles. It was the same every day at the lodge. We were bored out of our minds. I'm almost glad Balan dropped by. Please don't even joke, Callum whines. That only makes her smirk. I think the boredom came closer to killing me than he did. Rayla. But the afternoon wears on, and when the others do come back just after sunset, they have an armful of fish and firewood with them, and Rowena visibly relaxes when she sees that everything's been okay in her absence. Later, as they settle in for the night, Claudia uses her other mirror, the one paired to Ezran's, to let him know they are headed for the Nexus. His relief is palpable, even through the spikiness of his handwriting. She reads his messages out to them as they come. Thank the gods. I'll send Aunt Amaya to meet you there. Pretty sure Rayla's uncle said he's coming too. Anya sends her best. Callum and Rayla share a look. My uncle, she says, frowning quizzically. Ranan's coming. Claudia grimaces. Sorry, she mumbles. I should have mentioned it. But Ez couldn't not tell him. He's kinda mad that we didn't tell him when it first happened. In any case, if Balan's been fooling around with dark magic, we need all the help we can get. I hope you're not mad. I'm not, says Rayla, but she's still frowning. But, his arm. A wave of guilt crosses her face, and for the first time in a while, Callum is reminded that that arm is gone because of them. Rayla probably only blames herself for it, but the real truth is that they all had a hand in it, whether she wants to admit it or not. Callum grips her fingers. He wouldn't be coming if he wasn't up to it, Rayla. Yes, he would. She skulls. I would. Where do you think I got it from? From his corner of the cave, Soren snorts. Yeah, no offense, but if your kid is as even half as stubborn as you, I'm never babysitting it. He shakes his head and pulls the vial of potent serum from his pocket. If he needs it, he can have half. Okay. Not really, mutters Rayla, but she doesn't argue the point. It's not exactly a comfort. Half each would be a hell of a gamble for Soren and Ranan, and Callum's pretty sure that the only thing that would truly comfort Rayla right now is if somehow Balan got mauled by his own shadow wolves and Ranan didn't have to worry at all, but he's going to turn up whether they want him to or not, and Soren's offer is better than nothing. Soren snorts. Thanks, Soren, he mocks, his voice annoyingly high and terribly accented. You're so generous. We're gonna name our next child after you. No, we're not, says Rayla sharply, but her lips quirk upwards, just a little. But thank you. X. The rest of the trip is slow, but it's uneventful. There are no shadow wolves, and no indications of being tracked by dark magic, not even a bantha to slow their progress. It's almost too easy, but then, Callum's not about to complain. The easier the trip, the safer it is for Rayla, and at 31.5 weeks along now, they can't afford for it not to be. Things are getting a little too close for comfort. The tendency of halfling babies to come early weighs heavily on all their minds, so heavily that Rowena ducks into the village halfway up the mountain to top up her stash of herbs and medicinal supplies out of the concern that Rayla might go into labor by the end of the month. It's a terrifying thought. When they reach the top of the mountain at long last, Luyan is waiting for them and frowning at their little entourage. Not that I don't appreciate your company, your highnesses, but I see you've brought some friends. She eyes Soren and Claudia uneasily, and too late, Callum remembers that the last time they were here was 4 years ago, when they were the ones trying to kill Rayla in an effort to bring him and Ez home. They are our friends, says Rayla firmly, allowing Callum to help her off Kuritsa. I'm sorry we couldn't warn you that we were coming again so soon, but we need somewhere safe to stay. We were hoping, she trails off uncertainly, like she suddenly realized how rude it is to turn up on someone's doorstep unannounced and looking for somewhere to hide. But Luyan's features soften, and her eyes flit to Rayla's belly, the swell obvious even under the fabric of Callum's cloak. How far along are you now? Now, she asks, like she'd known when they first came to visit before the wedding. In all fairness, she probably had. Luyan is sharper than she pretends to be. Her wisdom might leave a lot to be desired, but she's certainly perceptive, and it's hard to be surprised. Almost 32 weeks, says Rayla, ducking her gaze. But Luyan only smiles. Come on, then, she says, beckoning them forwards. I'm sure you'll have an explanation for me over dinner, but it's not so polite to leave a pregnant princess without some place to have her baby. Let's get all of you warmed up. Chapter 21. Summary. With all due respect, Your Highness, what the actual foo? Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Xzi. In spite of her generally errant wisdom, Luyan passes no judgment on their story, at least none that would show on her face. Guarding the moon nexus makes keeping up to date difficult, and except for few visitors she's had since Rayla's last visit, other moon shadow elves, mostly, those wanting to reclaim the nexus as she had, she's heard nothing of trouble in the capital, and of the trouble with Balan. She listens carefully. Looks verifiably disgusted that someone would attempt to assassinate a pregnant woman, and properly horrified when they, reluctantly, tell her how close Rayla came to losing the baby. She seems less distrustful of Soren and Claudia by the end of it, and when she turns to face Rowena, it's not distrust that crosses her face so much as it is hesitance. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer someone, more familiar with elves to deliver the child? Rowena scowls at her, but Rayla interjects sharply before an argument erupts at the table in her defense. I don't know anyone who's had more experience with halfling pregnancies, she snaps. Do you? Luyan presses her lips shut at that. She means well, Rayla thinks, and from a certain standpoint, she can understand. Healthcare in Xadia is generally more advanced, and it's only recently that humans have had the chance to learn from elves, but Rowena's actions and professionalism have literally saved her child's life already, and maybe it's a combination of hormones and emotional attachment, or maybe it's because she's been dealing with it for too long, but Rayla no longer has the patience for thinly veiled digs at humans from elves and vice versa. She gives Luyan a look, not quite a glower, but bordering on one all the same. It's a challenge. An unspoken dare to object. Luyan doesn't. Instead, she tilts her head at them, curious. So what do you intend to do, then? You can stay here as long as you need. You can have the baby here, if you want. But what, exactly, is the plan from here? Callum catches Rayla's eye. A grimace forms on his lips. My aunt will rendezvous with us up here, he tells her. We can regroup. Come up with a strategy. For now, if it's all right with you, that is, we want to keep Rayla here until we get this guy. Actually, Rayla pauses, wincing a little as her womb spasms, a not so gentle reminder of how close things are getting. It passes after a moment. I have something like a plan. Her voice lilts upwards at the word plan, like it's less of a plan and closer to a stab in the dark because, well, it is. She's no stranger to stupid ideas, she's married to Callum, but this probably tops them all. It's something she'd come up with at the Bantha Lodge when they'd found the rune within the sheath of that dagger, and when everyone turns to stare at her, she reaches for her pack and pulls it out of the front pocket. Callum's breath hitches and a scowl crosses his face. Why do you still have that? Rayla presses her lips together. The dark magic rune is still there, its ominous glow hard to even look at, but there are other runes on it now, smaller, brighter ones that circle the first to negate its power. Claudia's always been a talented mage, but she's better at moon magic than Rayla ever thought she'd be. She'd picked it up quickly enough, and Ayla's book of spells had certainly helped, but some of the things she's conjured have looked as real as Luyan's, and those hounds she'd summoned to fend off Balan's wolves had done their job until her exhaustion caught up with her. The runes she'd written into the sheath are just the same, simple, effective, and holding strong, even now. She pushes her chair back as Rayla drops the sheath onto the center of the table. Luyan picks at it, frowning at the runes. A cloaking spell, she says, her eyes darting to Claudia and back as she turns the leather over in her hands. A strong one, at that. I'm impressed. This is how you got away, is it? More or less, mutters Claudia. It's how he can't find us, anyway. Rayla sucks in a breath. She glances at Callum, and the way his shoulders are tensed at the very sight of it, at Claudia and at Soren, who look varying shades of uneasy, and at Rowena, who looks downright afraid. She sets her jaw. Balan's not that clever, she starts carefully, steeling herself for the reaction that will follow. The only thing he's had that we haven't is time to think, and now that we know that it's him, we have that too. His primary goal is to find me. I think we should let him. There's a beat. And then. Are you crazy? Have you gone insane? You want him to find you? With all due respect, Your Highness, what the actual foo? Rayla holds up her hands. Their collective outrage is strangely comforting. They've been run off their feet trying to protect her for months, and still, after all they've been through, after all the trouble it's been, they're adamant to keep her and her baby safe. It's sweet, and she's grateful to them for it, but she wouldn't need it under literally any other circumstance. I'm sick of hiding, she says, her voice firm, a hint of frustration in the way it cracks. I'm done running away from him. This ends now, and this might be our one chance to draw him out into the open. By using yourself as bait, snaps Callum. He's furious at her for even suggesting it, and Rayla can see it like it's stamped across his face. Rayla, what makes you think any of us would agree to this? What makes you think I would? You're carrying our child and you want him to find you. If he's busy looking for me, he can't keep causing trouble in the city, says Rayla shortly. That's where we're at now, isn't it? He wants elves out of the human kingdoms and he's provoking them into violence to do it. What do you think is going to happen here? If we give him time to get back to the capital, he's going to try and force us back by causing trouble we can't ignore. We have to draw him out now. This is stupid, especially for you, says Soren, scowling. What happened to playing smart? What was even the point of us keeping you safe if you're just going to pull something like this? I am not what matters here, snarls Rayla. You keep me safe, fine, but how's that going to work for you when there are riots in the streets? That's not any safer, Soren, and I am not going to have this child in a world where people like Balan want it dead for what it is. Claudia lets out a sigh, clearly displeased, but she squares her shoulders and tugs the boys back. How would this even work, she asks Rayla. And I'm not saying I'm going along with it, she adds quickly, when Callum rounds on her. But, how? What, exactly, do you intend to do? Rayla makes a face, hesitant because the rest of this plan sounds even worse. Break the cloaking spell, she says. It'll tell him exactly where we are again, and he'll come to us instead of us looking for him. He'll come here, where all of you will be waiting for him. He's not that stupid, Rayla snarls Callum. He'll know it's a trap. He'll also know I'm vulnerable, she snaps back. Why do you think he waited so long when he knew, the whole time, that we were at the lodge? He wanted you out of the way, and he wanted me too far along to be even remotely mobile. With all of you here, he's only got one chance left. He's not going to waste it. When would that be, exactly, demands Soren. You know exactly when. Rayla gives them all a look, but it's Rowena who translates for them. Her face is pale and her voice is hoarse, and the words that leave her mouth almost sets Callum, and Claudia, and Soren into another explosion of outrage. You want to provoke him into coming here when you go into labor? Another beat. And then? Are you crazy? You're insane. This is insane. No, that's Callum. His face is hard and angry, his hands balled into fists at his side. No. No, and that's final. I'm not letting you do this. Rayla clucks her tongue, unimpressed by his gall. Oh, like I've ever needed your permission. I'm not discussing this. Have you got a better plan then? Anything is better than this, snarls Callum. We're done talking about this, Rayla. We don't have a choice, Callum, this is our only chance to get the upper hand. No. Callum slams a hand against the table, the resounding thud so heavy that Rayla's words die on her tongue. He doesn't look at her, and when he gets up so quickly that his chair tips over behind him. We're done talking about this. Callum. Enough, Rayla. No, snarls Rayla. She gets up too, wincing as she goes, but she stands her ground and glares at her husband, her hands set protectively over her bump. The others stare at them, a mix of wordless and terrified, but she doesn't look at them. She only scowls at him. This stops now. He has to go. I can't have this child while he's out there, Callum. And I can't lose you to him, roars Callum. His outburst echoes in the silence and Rayla falters, his fury ringing in her ears. His breath falls heavily through bared teeth, and when he finally looks at her, the anguish on his face breaks her heart. I can't, he whispers. I won't. Rayla swallows, a lump forming in her throat. Callum. No, he manages. I need a minute. He turns. Kicks his upturned chair out of the way. He doesn't look back. She finds him later, sulking on a bench a little way away with his head in his hands and the end of his scarf pressed into his eyes. Rayla can't really blame him, it really is the stupidest plan she's ever come up with, and it's so dangerous that she'd have been surprised if he hadn't put up a fight. Callum has every reason to be angry at her for it, but it had occurred to her far too late in their argument that he's just as mad at himself. He still feels guilty about letting that dagger come into her hands. He's still furious at himself for being so far away when she needed him most. She's always been the protector in their relationship. She's always been the more physically capable, and for years it had been her protecting him and very rarely the other way around. Now that she doesn't have a choice but to allow herself to be protected for once, all he's wanted to do is keep her safe, and instead, they'd almost lost the baby, and he'd given her the thing that brought Balin and his men to her for a second attempt at her life. The truth is that it's not his fault. Neither of those things were the result of his failure to protect her, but to him, that must be exactly how it feels. She'd feel the same, if it were her. The very thought of it makes her heart ache. Rayla lets out a sigh, and she climbs onto the bench next to him and rests her head against his shoulder. He doesn't stop her, but he doesn't say anything either. He only shudders, and Rayla tugs his hands from his face, laces her fingers with his, and presses a kiss into the back of his hand. "I'm sorry," she murmurs. Callum says nothing for a while. Rayla almost considers letting him be for longer, but in the end, he squeezes her fingers back and sighs as well. "I'm sorry too," he whispers. "I didn't mean to yell. I was just scared." Rayla scoffs. "Me too," she tells him. "I have been since we found out, remember? Of motherhood and all that it implies. But I'm more scared of him, Callum. He won't stop. He never will. At least if it's me, I can fight back, you know. Our daughter can't do that. And there'll be a time when she'll wander off or something and we won't be able to protect her." And she swallows, afraid to finish the sentence. "We have to stop him. Whatever it takes." "Whatever it takes," mutters Callum, gripping her hand tighter. I can't lose you, you know. I can't even, the thought of it." "I get it." She shifts, prying his hand out of her so she can drape it around his shoulders instead. "You won't," she promises. When we left the Bantha Lodge, I had Claudia project an image of me to him to buy us time. We can do that again. Luyan's here too, and she'll help, I'm sure of it. We can hide in the village or something, fool him into believing I'm here when I'm not. He doesn't even have his men anymore, and if you're here, and you're waiting with General Amaya and Ranan and Soren, we can get him once and for all." The words come out barely louder than a whisper, but there's fire in them all the same. Callum swallows, still afraid, but the hope that they might end this is stronger. His hands drift to her belly, and he holds them there, letting the thought of meeting his future daughter strengthen his resolve. "We're gonna get him," he says at last. "Just for you. So you can grow up safe and happy and unafraid. You'll get to play hide and seek with Bait, and you'll get to meet ZYM, and learn magic with me, and how to keep yourself safe with Mum. He's never going to come anywhere near you. I promise." Rayla grimaces as the baby shifts, but she smiles anyway and presses her lips against the crown of Callum's head. "She'll hold you to that. X." They get a similar reaction from Ranan when he arrives at the Nexus a couple of days later. He looks harried and tired when he appears under the worn stone gates, and understandably so, he's traveled a long way. Rayla meets him there, half waddling along the path with one hand rubbing at the small of her back, and the other bracing her still growing bump. He drops his things the moment he sees her, his bow clattering against the stones, his pack with a heavy thump, and the next thing Rayla knows is his arms as he envelops her as gently as possible. "You're so much bigger than last time," he breathes, touching her belly. "Thanks, I think," snorts Rayla. "She's stubborn. A little like you, honestly." Ranan's lips twitch a little. "I think you mean yourself," he teases. It's just a feeling. I might still be wrong, but I really think so. That's the smoothest it goes." Rayla tries to help him with his things only to be scolded for it, and then scolded again for not telling him sooner that someone tried to have her killed. She only rolls her eyes at his admonishments, but when she brings him up to date on what's been happening, and on what she intends to do, his face twists into a scowl so severe, she wonders if she's about to be grounded. You want to do what? It'll be fine, she promises quickly. We have 3 extremely talented moon mags here, we just want to fool him into thinking I'm here to give Callum and the others time to get him. I won't be here for it. It's fine. He rounds on Callum. You're letting her do this? Callum grimaces at him, his shoulders rising in a half shrug. You try talking her down, he says weakly. And, she's right. If we don't do this, he'll force our hand by provoking riots in the capital. If we do, at least we know he'll wait until. Until when? Callum shakes his head, his lips shut tight because he knows it's ridiculous and dangerous and the stupidest thing Rayla's ever come up with in her life, and because he's not entirely keen to endure Ranan's wrath. Until she goes into labor. Ranan rounds on Rayla, muttering a string of curses so vile that Rayla feels like she should cover her ears on behalf of her unborn child's. What in the